Good afternoon, everyone. We will start the webinar shortly. We'll give people some time to log in and join the meeting before we get started. Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of our winter meeting of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Standing Committee on Offshore Wind Energy and Fisheries. I'm Caroline Bell, staff member on the National Academy's Ocean Studies Board and responsible staff officer for this standing committee. On behalf of the committee chair, Jim Santrico, and our standing committee, I welcome you to the second part of our virtual meeting. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome back to those that were online yesterday. For those who couldn't join yesterday, we will, and anyone who's wishing to rewatch portions of the meeting, if you were online yesterday, we will have the recording and slide presentations posted onto the event website in the coming days. Today, I'll keep introductions and welcoming remarks brief so that we can jump into the presentations and discussion that we have today. We had a great presentations and discussions yesterday. Thank you again to Thomas Mormon from Boehm about his presentation on the Atlantic croaker fish kill observations during construction on the Central Virginia offshore wind site. And then a presentation from Mike Pohl on ROSA's new data management committee and their request for proposal, which is closing soon, which included a topic area related to the availability of data, frameworks to inform regional fisheries monitoring, and cumulative assessments through data integration, evaluation, and analysis. And we had some good discussion on both of those topics. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, in our virtual meeting format, please enter your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. We will work to go through and either answer the questions live if we have time, or committee members may also be answering questions, written answers to the questions. During our Q&A period, we will be moderating and getting to committee members' questions first, but we will bring up some of the public questions as well. And then if there's not time to answer all of the public questions, we will be sharing those with the speakers and work to try to get some answers after the meeting. But we do appreciate comments and questions that are put into the Q&A. They help to shape future meeting topics for this committee and discussions. And no, it's a challenge sometimes to get through all of the questions, but please keep them coming. They're things that help the committee determine what we are thinking about discussing in future meetings. And also, before we begin the presentations, I do just want to ask again that all meeting participants help us to foster a productive dialogue during our meetings by keeping questions and comments professional, and we will work our best to get to as many public questions and comments. And one note on the later presentations this afternoon, where we'll talk a little bit on the hydrodynamics and larval disbursement and modeling. The topic for part of our topic for a spring meeting for the standing committee will dive a little bit deeper into some of the hydrodynamic related issues around offshore wind development. So we will help use your comments and questions, both from the public and from the discussion of committee members and our presentations today, to help shape part of that future meeting. And with that, I would like to now introduce Liesl from Coonamessett Farms to share your work on a new non-lethal survey method. Oh, you're muted.
I am.
Right.
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to talk to you today about a project that we began in 2022 with funding from the Department of Energy and BOEM. I'm going to turn off my video while I'm doing this just to make sure there's no bandwidth issues during the presentation. Okay, does everybody see the presentation okay?
It's not sharing yet.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me just... How's that?
All right, it looks like it is. There we go. We've got it up and running. Perfect.
Okay, so as I was just saying, this is a project that we started in 2022 with funding from the Department of Energy and BOEM. The focus of the project is to come up with a standardized non-lethal optical survey method using a bunch of different survey tools that I'll talk about as we go through this presentation. There's a lot of partners on this project. We're working with the UMass School of Marine Science and Technology to improve their open cod and video trawl survey. So that is one of the survey methods that we're going to be working on developing standardized techniques for. We're also working with a couple of companies doing technology development. We're working with a company out of New York called Kitware. They do a lot of work on computer vision and machine learning. And we're also working with another company out of Oregon called Sexton Corporation. They're developing some custom cameras for us to put on some of our camera systems. We're also working with a whole bunch of different commercial fishing companies. These companies are providing research vessels for the actual surveys, and they're also serving on our advisory panel, so giving us a broad perspective on the work that we're doing. So the objectives of this project are twofold. First, we are planning to develop a methodological framework for monitoring commercial fish and invertebrate species in wind farms using a suite of optical survey methods. This will include developing preferred survey designs, making freely available a bunch of automated detectors for key commercial fish species, and image sets for people to train new machine learning algorithms. And then we will provide any schematics and technical drawings for new gear that we develop during this project, specifically our ropeless stationary camera systems and the open cod and video trawl. And the other thing we're hoping to do, this is sort of depends on the kind of data we collect, is to actually use the data we collect developing these surveys to evaluate the impacts of the offshore wind development on commercial fish species and benthic habitat. That will, I'm sure you've discussed before that can be a little tricky, particularly if your survey doesn't last long enough and have enough data collected before, during, and after wind farm development. So, we're going to give it a shot, but that may be a difficult thing to do. This project actually runs through 2028, but we're, because of the way that the wind farm development is turning out to take place, it's going to be tough for us to actually survey during all the different time periods we're hoping to cover. So right now we're at this sort of limbo period between the first budget period, which was largely focused on planning, and the second budget period when we're starting the surveys. We just finished budget period 1 that lasted for 2 years. And during that time, we were establishing relationships with all of our project partners. We completed a peer-reviewed survey design that went through review with all the members of our advisory panel, so scientists, members of NGOs, and commercial fishermen. We went out and we did some tests with our modified video trawl, and we've been designing and testing our ropeless camera system. We added sonar to our HabCam V3 towed optical survey vehicle, which we use for scallop surveys. and we've been continuing to work on our automated detector models. Starting this spring, we're going to get out for our first set of surveys. So that'll be a HabCam video trawl and a stationary camera survey. And then we will do that whole set of 3 surveys again in the fall of 2025 and in the spring of 2026, and then spring and fall of 2027. Meanwhile, we'll continue developing the project database and working on the automated detector models. And once we finish all the surveys, we'll work on that statistical analysis, trying to look at the impacts of offshore wind with the data we've collected, and also make all of the automated detector models we've created available online for anyone to use. The project deliverables.
Oh, did anyone else lose audio?
Yes, I think we lost Lee's.
Yeah, lost audio.
Let's see if I can message her.
Oh.
Oh,
Am I back?
yes, you're back.
Okay, that's weird. Where did I cut out?
It was right before, I don't know if you were looking to shift slides, but you had just finished kind of talking about period 3.
Period 3. Okay. Yeah. No, I was just sort of going over the project deliverables probably when I cut out. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So in addition to holding regular meetings and progress reports for the project, we're going to be starting to get some peer review publications out, getting those drawings and technical specifications available, and also working on the automated detectors. So this is where the project surveys are going to be taking place. The big orange polygon is the area that was approved for research under our biological opinion. We made that fairly large because, again, we weren't sure where we were going to actually do the surveys back when we were going through this process. And after sort of paying attention to timelines and where the different wind farms are in terms of construction status, we've settled on doing the research in the 3 Orsted wind lease areas. So that would be Revolution, South Fork, and Sunrise Wind. And so that map shows you the blue is the outline of our survey area with all the currently planned locations of the turbines shown with the black dots. If that changes, we'll adjust the survey area as needed. So we are focusing on a set of commercial fish species based on both the likelihood of us seeing these species in this area and the importance of these species to the commercial fisheries operating in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island waters. So that includes squid, the skate species, a couple of flounder species, scup, black sea bass, some hake species, monkfish, Joan and rock crabs, American lobster, and sea scallops. We're sure we'll see all of those. It also includes Atlantic cod just because of the importance of developing better methods for surveying cod, even though we're probably less likely to see them in the surveys than some of the other species. So the first survey tool we're going to be using is our HabCam V3 vehicle. This is a towed optical camera system that we use routinely for scallop surveys. We've been running scallop surveys using the HabCam V3 vehicle since 2017. We completely took over doing the scallop surveys with this vehicle in 2018. During HabCam surveys, we towed 24 hours a day, continuous survey tracks over the area in question that we're surveying. You can see a map off to the right that shows you what our track might look like for a survey of the Georges Bank scallop areas. So these, we plan these survey tracks to be roughly 2 to 3 kilometers apart, covering the entire area that we're focused on surveying. This HabCam vehicle is flown about 2 to 3 meters off the bottom. It varies depending on conditions and clarity of the water. And it gives us about a roughly 1 meter squared field of view, plus or minus, a meter squared, depending on how high we're flying the vehicle. And we end up taking pictures every 5 pictures every second with our new system. And that gives us an overlapping mosaic of images where we can actually, see a continuous image track. For our survey analysis, we tend to look at annotating the organisms that are present in roughly 1 in every 50 to 100 images. But the additional data is available if for some reason we need to zoom in and focus on an area more carefully. After we get this data, we can develop relative abundance maps, and we can, either Krieg the data or somehow otherwise stratify and summarize the data to get biomass estimates, to look at changes in salinity, temperature, and other things that we collect with the vehicle. As I said earlier, one of the things we did for this project in particular was we are adding sonar to our HabCam vehicle, primarily so that we can have some extra warning when we are traveling through the wind lease areas where there might be obstacles that we're not used to encountering in these areas where there's construction going on, and there's turbines and cables and everything else that could damage our vehicle. So we did this during this budget period, and that just shows you what the sonar looks like. This is a Blue View sonar from Teledyne. So the other survey tool we'll be using is the Open Cod-End video trawl that SMAS developed. They've been using this for a while. They've tested it. I think back in 2017, they tried running surveys using the Open Cod-End video trawl in the Vineyard Wind Lease area. But there was an issue with the bottom being too soft, and because there was so much silt, it was kicking up silt clouds, and they really couldn't see what was in the video. So one of the focuses of this project was to figure out how we could modify the video trawl to allow it to be used on hard and soft bottom successfully for both the wind surveys and other surveys that SMAS might be interested in conducting. So the video trawl itself, basically there's a cylinder right at the beginning of the cod end, and it is equipped with cameras and lights and sensors, and they tend to tow most of the time with the cod end open, so anything that would have been caught in the trawl actually passes right through. But they do have the option of closing the cod end to collect the species at like a normal trawl and calibrate the imagery they're collecting with a video trawl. So during our first budget period, we went out and we did tests with the video trawl. We conducted these tests both in the greater Vineyard Wind lease area where they had used it previously unsuccessfully because of the silt problem, and around that area as well, all in soft bottom. We tested a couple of different modifications. One of them was just making the net longer. And if you can see those drawings of the trawl net design, you can see it's longer. We also tested a kite, which lifted the trawl up off the bottom by placing it at the cod end. And we tested putting belly panels on there because there were some publications that suggested that could also reduce the silt showing up in the video. And it turned out that while the belly panels were not very useful, changing the length of the trawl net was incredibly useful, and it completely changed the quality of the video. So I'm hoping you guys can see this. Is that video running? I hope. So that's what it looked like before with the old net. As you can understand why they really weren't able to use this in soft bottom. It's just a cloud of silt. But when we lengthened the net in the same areas, we were getting video like that. So a complete change in the quality of video, and the tool is now very useful on soft bottom. Shut these down. So that was a really exciting result. It was a great way to start the fieldwork for this project. So the final survey tool we're testing are stationary cameras. We're planning to use 2 different kinds of stationary cameras. The first ones will be anchored systems, and we'll do short deployments of 60 to 90 minutes to collect video using a baited system. And that image there shows what our baited camera frame looks like. We did some previous work using this system to try to develop a survey method for blue and golden tilefish. The other thing we're going to be doing is putting the same cameras that we're developing for these anchored systems into the ropeless lobster traps that EdgeTech has developed for the lobster fishery. And you can see we have one of the cameras mounted inside one of those traps right there. And so we did some work testing this summer. So here's what our anchored camera system looks like. The cameras themselves that we're having built are equipped with stereo camera system. They have integrated lights, they have a temperature depth sensor, and they have a hydrophone for recording any sounds in the area as well. And that just shows you an example of what some of the stereo images look like when we took the cameras out and tested them in a local pond. We went out, again, this fall to test the system in Buzzards Bay. And you can see there we are in a lobster boat getting ready to deploy the camera systems. At the same time, we went out to learn how to use the EdgeTech ropeless lobster traps to make sure we understood how the systems work and could safely deploy them and retrieve them with the cameras on board. So the other thing we're doing in addition to going out and conducting these optical surveys is we are developing these automated detectors that will be made publicly available for anyone to use. So we're working with a company called Kitware, and they have an open source online platform called Viami, Video and Image Analytics for Marine Environments. It's set up so that people can not only use already built models, but they can actually develop their own models. So you can do both on the system, and it's all publicly available. So we previously received funding from the Sea Scallop RSA Research Set-Aside Program to start working with Kitware. At that time, we were starting to develop automated scallop detectors and automated flounder detectors. So this image shows you what the kind of results we were getting with the automated scallop detectors. If you can see in there, you can see there's some green boxes. Those are from our human manual annotations, and the blue boxes are from the automated detectors. So these detectors are pretty good. At this point, they're in the 90+ range in terms of accuracy relative to human annotations. So we're starting to feel comfortable using them for our research. One of the other things that we did that was kind of fun with this project was we developed a way to actually take our stereo images and create these 3D mesh images so we could actually see the scallops and the bottom in full 3-dimensional relief. So you can see a scallop taking off and swimming off of sort of the uneven bottom with epifauna. We don't really have any practical need for this, but it's a great thing for sharing with people what we're doing and just making it more exciting. As I said, we also were working on developing flounder detectors. At the time, it was focused on trying to figure out if we could detect flounder more accurately with a automated detector than we can with people, because they can be very hard to see. And so this image just shows you that the detector actually was able to find a couple of flounder that our human annotators missed. So that's very promising. It's tough to talk about accuracy because if the automated detector is actually doing better than the human one, that's not really understood by the standard measurements for quantifying accuracy of models. One of the things we're working on now is taking advantage of our stereo camera systems and not only detecting the presence of species, in this case, of flatfish, but actually creating polygon masks around the fish and being able to measure them. So that will be part of the detector models that we make available. So detection and actually measuring things. The other thing we started working on with Kitware, and this was funded by a 2021 Sea Scallop Research Set-Aside grant, was developing habitat detectors and classifiers. This shows you an example of some of the classifiers that were developed and that are actually fairly accurate. So we're comfortable using them. They're in the 50%+ range in terms of accuracy, some of them much higher. So we're able to actually collect data on the presence of gravel and shell hash, bryozoans, which are a very important epifauna species out on scallop grounds, sea stars, sand dollars, burrowing anemones. So at this point, really the accuracy of these models is limited by how many examples of the habitats we have. And as we collect more data, we should be able to expand the available benthic habitat models we have available for people to use. So we have just, with this grant, with the DOE BOEM grant, started working on developing the models for the less common species in our imagery. These require a slightly different method to actually develop the detectors, a little more hands-on, so-called mid-shot object detection that you can do with sort of sample numbers on the order of hundreds versus tens of thousands that you need for some of these deep learning options. So this just shows an example of detectors and polygon masks being created for red hake, sort of little winter skate, and Jonan rock crabs. So part of the peer review during the first budget period revolved around developing our survey design. And so I just wanted to quickly go over that with you. So the 3 different options we're using for optical surveys are all different in terms of how the surveys are conducted. And as I said earlier, so the HabCam is a 24-hour constant track. So we tow 24 hours a day. You know, if everything's going well, the HabCam goes in at the start and it doesn't come up until we're done days later. So this is what the survey track is probably going to look like for our lease area, the Orsted lease areas for this project. We'll be able to go through roughly every 2 to 3 of the turbine lanes. That may change depending on what's there, if there are any obstacles in the way, if there's any other survey gear. For instance, we've had to shift some of our survey tracks for an Orsted funded project we have in just the Sunrise lease area because somebody had passive acoustic monitors in there, or there was other construction going on. So there's a lot of back and forth with the wind companies to make sure that it's safe for us to use the track. We share it with them. They get back to us and let us know if there are obstacles in the way, and we shift the tracks if we have to do so. These surveys in the end will give us a relative abundance estimate, so the density of the organisms in the area. And again, we could also potentially generate biomass estimates for the species that we annotate. Video trawl is a little different. What we'll probably do for the video trawl surveys is, we can define all of the potential lanes that we could go through with the video trawl, and then we will sort of randomly select which ones we're going to do. We'll deploy the video trawl outside of the turbine area, go through all the way, and then pull it back up when we get to the other side. We've been talking to the fishermen we're working with, and they're fairly comfortable towing these longer tracks. But again, we haven't done this yet, and there is a lot of concern with fishermen about trying to tow fishing gear inside the wind lease areas. So this will be a good test for how comfortable they are actually continuing down between these turbine bases with their gear. Again, this is, again, we may have to change things depending on the presence of obstacles. And the total number of tracks we're going to be able to do will be limited by the length of the survey trip. So that's limited by our budget. This sort of shows roughly what we might expect to be able to get done in a single trip. Again, we'll end up with relative abundance estimates in terms of density. So the stationary camera surveys are a little different. What has become the standard in terms of how you measure relative abundance for these surveys is something called max N, which is the maximum number of an organism, a target organism that you see in a frame during the set amount of video that you annotate. So that will present some challenges we analyze, because max N, how do you correlate a max N number to a relative abundance number? So that's something we'll be working on. But for these surveys, we're just going to use a publicly available grid, the one for GEBCO, and randomly select where we're going to locate the stationary cameras and also the ropeless cameras. The ropeless cameras will only be placed by turbine bases, just because sticking them out anywhere else is a little too risky in terms of losing expensive gear. And we're just going to be putting out as many of these cameras and deploying them and retrieving them as we can over 7 days. The ropeless cameras will be out there for the whole 7 days. The goal is to record sort of long-term over tidal cycles, diurnal cycles, and just see what kind of species are out there. In terms of estimating relative abundance, we'll be using the anchored cameras for that. And we'll see how many we can actually put out during the course of a single trip. So when we collect all the data, we're going to be trying to model the impacts of the wind farms on the relative abundance of those key species I showed you at the beginning. So by survey, we'll be looking at things like the distance from the turbine base, the proximity to other wind farms, standard environmental data that all of these things collect: depth, temperature, sound level, for the ones that have hydrophones available. We'll get habitat estimates using our detectors, and also some manual annotations. And then we'll also include season, because these surveys are going to be taking place in the spring and the fall. We'll be doing this with using both predefined distance strata, and we'll also be investigating using some post hoc stratification, seeing what works better by survey. We're also going to try to aggregate all the data, again, because the relative abundance estimates generated by these different surveys are not the same. This may be a little tricky, so we'll have to see if we can correlate max N to density numbers before we try to do this. But those models will be similar. They'll just also include information on what kind of survey it is. So at this point, as I said, we sort of just finished our big organizational and planning budget period, and we're going to be getting out into the field this spring. So our next steps in the immediate future are finalizing those custom stationary cameras we're having built. We're working with Sexton to improve the operation and improve the housing and the wiring and make it possible to swap out lenses and download the data in different ways. So trying to really make those cameras ideal for doing this kind of work. And then we'll be completing our first set of surveys in spring 2025 and hoping everything goes well. So I think that's it. If anyone has any questions, thank you again for letting us share this with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. It was a very interesting presentation and looks like a neat project to be working on. Let's see. So just a reminder to the public, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can throughout the Q&A and discussion period. And also committee members, please raise your hands if you have any questions or comments to discuss as we jump into the Q&A and discussion. Jim, you just came off mute.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I'll start and give some people. So thank you for the presentation. It seems pretty fascinating and definitely incredibly worthwhile. I have some specific science questions, but maybe I'll hold them off to the end because it might be getting a little bit too in the weeds quickly. I'm just curious about this, your ability or thoughts on being able to scale up these ideas across the entire East Coast as other areas begin developed. Like what kind of costs would we be thinking about? And then potentially using some of these on the West Coast and their applicability for off of California, for example.
I don't know if there's any reason you couldn't do these kinds of surveys in these other areas. Cost is certainly an issue. So, our HabCam vehicle, if somebody wanted to build one from scratch, it's got to be on the order of, $500,000 probably at this point. That said, people do already have similar vehicles. Other people use AUVs, so you could use the same kind of strategy in terms of collecting the data and analyzing the data if you had other optical gear that, flew above the ground at a similar height. The video trawl is, Nick gave me an estimate for it, but I feel like it was on the order of $100,000 to $150,000 modifications to an actual trawl. So again, it's not cheap, but if you knew you were going to use it, that would be a reasonable thing. Stationary cameras are probably the least expensive, and if they work well. Sort of the cameras themselves are going to run about $10,000. If people started buying them, I'm sure the cost would go down. The ropal straps are about $6,000 a piece. The camera frames are, a couple thousand. So, ideally, we hope people will start doing something similar. If nothing else, they can use the automated detector models. Those are available however people are collecting the data.
Lisa, when I was at Alaska Department of Fish and Game, we had a HabCam variant that we used for scallops up there. Do you know if that's still in service? That would be a West Coast asset.
I do not. We hear about other people using towed camera systems, but they're different ones and they have different names, and it's kind of hard to keep track of them. But in theory, it's a big steel frame with cameras attached. So as long as you've got people who are capable of towing it, you can develop something similar.
I'll promote the question in the Q&A. Just maybe you want to speak to coordination or collaboration with the Science Center and their data collection efforts, or how your data collection efforts could be utilized with theirs to improve abundance estimates overall, or just maybe speak to that partnership.
So they are advisory partners on the project. So on our advisory panel, we have somebody from NOAA participating. And in terms of our HabCam data collection, we are fully integrated into the stock assessment that NOAA does. So that ability certainly exists. We actually sort of split the scallop grounds effectively with NOAA. We do part of it, they do part of it, and the data is all combined and used for the stock assessment. We aren't there yet with the stationary cameras or with a video trawl, but again, that really just requires coordination. It also requires, some fairly in-depth analysis of the survey, the data collection, the reliability of the data, which has happened with HabCam, but hasn't with these other survey methods.
Daniel.
Yeah, Lisa, I was just gonna ask, well, make a comment. I mean, it's really attractive to see HabCam's uptake. I've been aware of it for the 20 plus years that it's been in development. So it's a really fantastic, mature tool, I think, and it just keeps getting better and better. So kudos to that. And I really was interested in the element of your presentation where you started looking at the detectors for the actual habitat, not just the species that exist in the habitat or on the habitat. Could you speak more to, like, just even if it's just thoughts about how you see that habitat data being assimilated into Garfo's work or into our public knowledge about the heterogeneity of the habitats out there or the homogeneity of them?
I mean, from our perspective, we hope to publish on this, and I hope more people will do similar things. We were we ended up doing this because we discovered that when our annotators would, we originally had our annotators just sort of tick a box, this is what your habitat is. And we found that people were not very good at consistently describing habitat. And so we decided we needed to come up with something a little more standardized. And so we went and looked at the CMEX, the Coastal and Ecological, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but anyway, it's sort of a standardized way to do it, almost with layers. You look at the geological substrate, the biological one. So we said, okay, we want to do something like that. So we had people go through our images very carefully and outline, here's sea stars, here's sand dollars, here's scallops, so we could develop these layers that you can actually use to do this. And our hope is that this is a much more standardized, reliable way to describe a habitat, and people can actually go out and use it and develop maps that are better than just somebody saying, oh, we're in sand, we're in rocks, we're in shell hash. But I don't think that test has happened yet, and I don't think we've gotten to the point where we can say to people, hey, this is so good, and we want you to use it. But that's our hope. And I noticed that when you look at a lot of the environmental impact statements for the wind farms, they in some ways are starting to use the same standard. So that's already happening, which is great.
Thank you.
All right, next, I think Stephen had his hand up.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. It was super interesting. My question is about timeliness from when you're doing field work to how fast information can be kind of produced from these different approaches. I know the machine learning has been kind of pitched as a strategy for speeding things up and making them more accurate, but I just wondered your thoughts on kind of where we are now when you go out and survey an area, how fast information can be produced and what that might look like if some of these either QA things work out well or the technology continues to develop that y'all are working on.
So we're pretty quick, actually. And again, I'm gonna talk a lot about HabCam because that's the more developed methodology and the one that we do a lot. But we do the HabCam surveys in June, sometimes into July. We have maps, abundance estimates, everything available for the assessment by the end of August. So it's a pretty rapid turnaround. It's stressful, it's a lot, but that's what we're capable of doing now that it's a standardized process and we have everything set up. Machine learning would certainly make that faster. The slow aspect of it is, getting all those people to actually go through and annotate it and then checking everything and entering all that data. So you could do it even better than 2 months. So I think that's pretty impressive and not a lot slower than sort of standard fisheries surveys like trawl surveys. I think we can get there with the other surveys, especially when we can automate things and we have some labor in the beginning. I mean, it's going to be For the project itself, it's going to be some slow going in the beginning because we're developing these detectors. That's very intensive, labor intensive. But if they're done and they're reliable, it's very quick. I mean, I was running, oh God, like 2 million images in 24 hours, which is, it's just crazy. Yeah, it's insane. So it's exciting.
Great, thank you. And just to clarify, so you mentioned that with AI you can make it faster. So the models that you're talking about now, are they not automated detection? Is it still humans that are going in and detecting in the imagery, or?
So what we've done is we've taken all of the human annotations that we've done over the years and sent that imagery and the annotation information to Kitware, and they've developed some detectors.
Okay.
So there are the habitat detectors, they exist now. We want to make them better. The scallop detectors exist now. We want to make those better. And the flounder ones are available. I'm not sure I would use this for a survey yet, but for this project, we're going to have to go through and carefully annotate all those other species and get adequate numbers for developing the models. As soon as they're done, they're made available.
Okay.
You can just go onto the Viami website and you can use them.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, Tricia.
Thanks. Hi, Tricia Yeadley. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I follow with some interest the offshore wind companies, particularly around the North Sea, investment in some of these new technologies for surveying. I know Ørsted in particular had partnered with Spore for AI bird monitoring. And I was just curious, I guess, to understand what the collaboration, if there's any partnership, if there's any work directly with Ørsted with respect to this surveying, because you're in those lease areas and construction is ongoing, and kind of how those learnings are kind of communicated or shared back and forth between the industry and just like a standalone study.
So in terms of Ørsted, we actually work with them directly as a contractor for some of their work. But for this project, we have advisory panel members from all of the major wind companies. So they are regularly updated. They participated in peer reviewing our survey design. So yeah, we're doing everything we can to keep them involved. And Ørsted in particular, since we're going to be in their lease areas, we are going to be serving. They have a group that meets to discuss just sort of what's going on out there and what kind of construction is happening. So we will be part of that going forward because we need to know what's going on before we can go out there and safely survey. So we will, be directly involved with that with that particular wind company.
Thank you. We'll take a couple questions that we have from our Q&A. The first one from Tim Sipple is there?
Steve has his hand up.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thanks.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah, I'm Steve Joner. I'm with the Makah tribe in Washington State. Thank you for that presentation. I may have missed it, but how long have those turbines been operational in the area you're surveying?
So right now, where we're planning to survey, the South Fork ones have been operational for, I think, a little over a year. Revolution is under construction. That's the one. And then Sunrise is actually pre-construction. So we sort of have a mix in the area we're going to be in.
Okay. And were there comprehensive enough surveys before the construction so you have a baseline to compare with what you're now seeing or what you will be seeing?
That's a tricky question. So certainly the wind companies themselves are going out and doing pre, during, and post-construction surveys. The data is not always available as you might wish as an outside scientist. We sort of are aware of what's going on in one of those lease areas because we work for Ørsted, but our ability to use that data for this project is unclear at this point. So I guess I'm hoping there is some and we can get our hands on it, but I don't feel confident at this point. I know that's not a great answer, but I think it's all I have right now.
Okay. And then Jim asked about application on the West Coast. As you probably know, there are 5 lease areas in California, but no construction has started yet. The developers are just now starting to work on their initial development plans. But there are a number of areas in California where there are either in the national marine sanctuaries that are in close proximities to these lease areas, or areas where there are essential fish habitat restrictions on conservation areas, areas closed to bottom contact gear and so on. And, you know, I just think this might be helpful in doing surveys in some of those areas. One of the things that many of us on the West Coast are really trying to encourage is for the sanctuaries, even though there will be no wind energy development within the sanctuaries, they'll be close enough to the sanctuary boundaries that it's undoubtedly going to have some impact on the sanctuary resources. So I think we might be contacting you about getting some ideas on surveys for those areas.
That would be great. I mean, I think, getting as much data as possible and some consistency is tricky. And I, when I was listening in yesterday, I know that Ron Smolowitz, who I work with, brought this up. But, I think trying to understand how to standardize the surveys being done across different areas and eventually create data sets that can allow you to look for changes and trends is really tricky. I mean, my experience to date and sort of paying attention to what's going on is every wind farm kind of does their own thing. Sometimes there's overlapping, sometimes they hire the same group to do the surveys and there's some consistency. Different research groups kind of do their own thing, the things that they're most interested in. But there's some overlap. So I don't know how you create a standardized method. I'm hoping that, we can play a part in that and offer people options that have been tested, that are reliable, and that can be, used with machine learning and are attractive to other people.
I agree that that's a challenge, but I'll say that we on the West Coast are up to that challenge.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you for your question, Steve. And so Tim's question kind of follows pretty closely to what Steve had just asked, but his question was, is there any sense of how well abundance estimates from these methods compare to legacy methods? And hopefully the confidence intervals on estimates between this and legacy methods overlap.
So I would say for the video trawl, it's actually very good. They do, they use a standard NEFOP trawl. They have a lot of experience doing standard trawl surveys, and they've actually compared the video trawl estimates to the standard trawl survey methods, and the overlap in the agreement is very good. I think the biggest question is with the stationary camera things. That method of estimating relative abundance is very different than what other surveys do. So it's going to be tricky. There's a lot of work being done with those underwater camera systems, and I think maybe we'll get there, but right now I think that's a little bit questionable. I think the only place where those systems are used regularly for surveys is down in the Southeast. In some of the areas there, Southeast Fisheries uses them some.
Thank you. Tricia?
I just wanted to add in response to Stephen's question that actually we're kind of fortunate because this Rhode Island Mass wind energy area was the first federal wind energy area, and the state of Rhode Island, through its Coastal Resources Management Council, did a comprehensive ocean special area management plan. Usually those plans are only out to 3 nautical miles, but this was the first plan in the country that went 30 nautical miles out. And they did a lot of, I think almost 3 years in advance of it being identified as a wind energy area by the federal government. They did a lot of baseline studies. And I have a link I can provide. I'm not quite sure how to provide that to people, but there are specific chapters. One was specific to commercial and recreational fisheries, and they go through all of the commercially and recreationally important fisheries in the area. And there's appendices there on that chapter on kind of the baseline surveys. So I guess I'm just curious whether you're aware of the baseline data that was collected as part of that comprehensive state process. I think even Massachusetts was involved, and just how and if you are aware, like how your data, or if you plan to kind of compare the data you're collecting to that to that baseline data.
I'm aware of it. I haven't dug into it to the degree that I can talk about whether or not I'll be able to use it. But I mean, we certainly intend to get our hands on as many different data types as we can that overlap our lease area that we're studying. The thing, I mean, fisheries data, I'm sure it's come up before, is, fisheries data is very patchy and very zero inflated. Most of the time you don't catch a lot. And so it's a tough data set to use. And so we probably are going to be somewhat limited to sticking with the seasons that we are working in, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I mention it is just because there were technical advisory committees that included commercial and recreational fishermen as representatives. So there's a lot of data that is, I think, that fed into that particular study that goes beyond just like the surveying. So it might be useful to just to take a look at that and have it. I'd be interested to see what the comparisons are, if there are any.
Yeah. I mean, again, we're really lucky that I think the fishermen that are very passionate and involved overlap. We have people on our panel who are involved in that study as well. So I'm hoping we can take advantage of this.
Great, thank you for that. Another question from the Q&A about the kitware VIAM, I guess the question here, let me read it verbatim. So from Elizabeth Jantz, was saying that she worked in 2020 using Python to annotate fish and images that were all rectangles. And her question is kitware VIAM now creating the masks, or is that something that you are creating on in your own model?
So I think that the masks are generated by the model. I would imagine it's doing it. I haven't dug into the details, but once you draw the rectangle, so the rectangle is where you say there's something there. There's something that we're interested in. It's something that's different, actually. And then it takes that rectangle and says, is this a fish? Is this substrate? Is this a rock? And so it classifies it. And then once that's done, it can actually draw an outline on something that's unique. And so that's kind of how you get through the different stages till you have the mask. And then once you have the mask, you can do things like measure if you know your camera specs. So that's sort of just built into the process.
Okay. Kind of a question along those lines. You had made the comment during the presentation that there are things that the model is picking up that your human observers aren't with, I think it was flounder. Are there times where you're getting false positive identifications in the imagery?
Oh, absolutely. And that, that kind of thing is, it's the difference between the human and the machine learning model that creates these accuracy estimates. It's tricky though when the human is wrong, because the assumption is when you develop these accuracy estimates that the human is correct. Right. And so that's why it's a little tough to start to talk about that, and can require a little thinking on our part. How do you do that? How do you tell when the model's better than the person?
Absolutely. All right, Brian.
Thanks. I didn't know if I should raise my hand or put a question in the Q&A, but my question is actually for the committee. And given the discussion we had yesterday around some of the questions of standardizations and trying to get to a point where we are using similar technologies, similar approaches across different areas. Given what Lisa presented today, what does the committee feel might be some drawbacks to adopting something that is non-extractive? I mean, it's relying upon some of the software to do your telling you what's down there versus hauling something on deck and people counting it and measuring it by hand. But before we even get into that question, I do want to, Lisa said at the very beginning, she mentioned the biological opinion needed for this. And I think I said yesterday that one of the advantages of using these types of technologies is that we hope not to have any impacts on ESA listed species. So I did want to, just for the committee's awareness, the Lisa did get a biological opinion with DOE, the Department of Energy, from the National Marine Fisheries Service to allow for potential takes to Atlantic sturgeon and some sea turtles from both the open and closed cod end. So even this, which looks on the surface to be pretty non-invasive and non not likely to negatively impact species, there was still them still found there to be some likelihood that some animals could be harassed, not necessarily not greatly injured, but harassed. So I just wanted to raise that just for awareness as well. But hopefully some of the results of this can maybe point to how animals actually pass through the open cod end and maybe get us to the point that's in the future where maybe that concern or that risk is reduced. So anyway, there was a lot there, but I wanted to try to get some input on what the committee sees as like, yeah, let's just do it. Or is it, maybe, because the first question that we written to earlier, how is this, people are so committed and so used to the traditional legacy methods, as the first Q&A said, and what do you guys feel might be some of the drawbacks to using this? Thanks. Sorry for being long-winded.
Go ahead, Jim.
So, let me just, I mean, I think, Brian, the key thing is that everything has to be calibrated, right? And so before you basically go off and adopt this, you'd have to be calibrating it to the legacy methods. And so you'd be wanting to do these in the same area to get that calibration at the same time. And that's basically how you could then begin to make a transition and more reliance on them. But before that, then you're just left with what could look like isolated good results, but you're not necessarily sure how to map that back into traditional stock assessment abundance measures or things that would be utilized in other parts of the management process. So that's my 2 cents as the chair. I saw Ron, you went up, and then Steve.
Yeah, I think, Brian, you're on to the main question, which is, let's just say that Lease finishes the project and they find that the S-mast open cod end trawl is an excellent non-lethal strategy. The catch could be compared to the past databases, that you could close the cod end once a day to get a biological sample. Everybody thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread on her advisory panel, which contains wind industry and fishermen. And like the discussion yesterday is, BOEM can't impose it. Who's in charge? Who decides this becomes the uniform sampling strategy, the sampling tool? That's the question right now.
So I was just gonna almost say what Jim said and agree with him on the calibration side of it. I guess the couple of points I would add is that it also might just not be thinking about it as either or, one versus the other. It may just be complementarity, that ultimately you need multiple strategies in different ways, because some of them are going to be more selective for certain types of fish and some are going to do better at other types of fish. And collectively, you may have to have multiple approaches to tell the full story in a region. And for that part, I just want to say I appreciated from Lisa's presentation how collaborative it seems like these programs have been developed and are implemented. And I think that working with your academic institutions that are available, the NOAA Fisheries science centers and groups that are working, and then the states, because they're all involved in collecting data that go into the stock assessment process. And then as Jim already mentioned, those processes are really good at looking at how to put these different pieces of information together through calibration or ultimately into a big stock assessment model. So having all of those pieces together and not necessarily having to think about it as one replacing the other, probably is what I would spend the most time looking at.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Daniel.
Sorry, I think Lisa was first before me.
Yeah, I just wanted to just touch base on the fact that, you know, when this project was first conceived, we were planning to calibrate against the Science Center's bottom trawl. They were hesitant to let us do that. We never quite understood why, but I'm hopeful that as this project progresses and if it's a promising technology, maybe we can still make that happen.
Brian, I think one of the things that I'm still trying to get my head around is so much. I mean, as you know, Daniel Doolittle, Integral Consulting, done a lot of essential fish habitat mapping for developers. I've been operating under the assumption that the data that we collect, the survey designs that we implement and collaboratively get approved by NIMS and BOEM, that data is serving a purpose of permitting a ocean installation. It's not to inform stock assessment. It's not to substitute or be calibrated against the stock assessment tools that we've had for long time series. And I think I keep struggling with, are we having purpose creep for this data? This data is just it's to really help pursue the NEPA process and inform other aspects where it can be useful. I love the adage, map it once, use it many times. So I think that's applicable. But I think to your question, one of the fundamental drawbacks is trying, the other old adage, with a hammer in your hand, everything's a nail. If we've got this great data set, is it the solution to all of these other concomitant questions that different regulatory bodies and agencies have? So I would love some commentary on that. That's the question I keep noodling around with. So I'll just add that for diversity's sake.
Maybe I could quickly respond to that and then we'll move to the other committee members. But yeah, no, that's something that comes up all the time, right? That yes, from BOEM's perspective, the purpose is to monitor the effects of the project. That's it. That it's not, doing stock assessments for managing fisheries across the region. However, we do recognize that there is a lot of interest in understanding that in the context of the stock assessment process and how can a management agency use that data. And so that ends up drawing it into that stock assessment conversation. But yes, from BOEM's perspective, it is looking at the effects of the project, and that's it. But there's others got their hands raised.
We'll go to Stephen and then Trisha.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to politely disagree a little bit on this one and make a point from yesterday. I think Daniel's got a good perspective, and I definitely see that side, that the purpose of this type of sampling and BOEM's responsibility is at the project level. But I think it becomes really important to think about the different types of information available if you make comparisons about ultimately numbers of fish impacted. That when you have a stock assessment that's been multiple years with lots and lots of pieces of information and lots of validation, makes an estimate of how many fish a sector of the fishery takes. And then BOEM has its types of information that it collects directly or through partners. It's really dangerous to make those comparisons, to say the fishery collected this many fish or killed this many fish, and by the way, our sampling or these observations was only this many, because those haven't gone through, may not have gone through the multiplication or the calibration that the other processes have done. So it's not so much saying that the sampling needs to be at a level to inform a stock assessment, as much as it is maybe understanding and communicating that these are just two very different pieces of information. And we can't necessarily, or maybe shouldn't necessarily, compare the number of fish removed or harmed in one activity versus what the stock assessment says a sector reduces. So I think just some complementarity and caution comparing those two is maybe what I would encourage.
Thank you, Tricia.
Well, I was going to go back and agree with Daniel on the purpose creep, but I think it's like, I just think we have to go, circling back, I guess, to your, like, the original framing for your question, Brian, like, why are we looking at non-lethal survey methods in the first place, is something that I think we have to kind of keep front of mind, that our approach to surveying using trawl survey methods, I think the Block Island surveying was like close to 800,000 fish, right? Like over the course of the years that they did that trawl survey. And there have been concerns that the offshore wind sector is interfering with gear, with their with their surveying methods. And so there's been this kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place of trying to get data, but also doing it in the least impactful way to habitat and the fisheries itself, and with the least amount of interference with the commercial and recreational fishing industry and sector. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't disagree with, Stephen and Jim in terms of wanting to kind of like build a body of evidence with respect to these new methods to see how accurate they are, because ultimately we have to have trust in the numbers if we're going to use them reliably, even if it's for just the NEPA process. People have to have a sense of transparency and accessibility to the methods and the data, and understanding that the conclusions are based on things that correspond to the methods, and the results that we've got correspond to the results we've gotten with more traditional methods. And that might just be something that takes time, to develop that evidence and satisfaction. But so maybe it's not like we close the door on, we can't close the door on the traditional methods just because something shows promise, but we can continue building that, so that we're creating an evolution toward less impactful, more accurate surveying methods.
Jim?
So very good, Brian, to ask a question that got us all going. So that's great. I actually think it would be valuable for our audience if someone parses how monitoring effects of a project does not tie into abundance in the medium and long term of the species. Because I'm having a hard time understanding what purpose creep means in this context, because to me, I think of monitoring the effects of a project as both over the short run and the long run. And the long run would entail how it impacts abundance estimates and marine mammal populations. And to me, that's where this calibration and the idea of being able to integrate the data. So maybe someone, Dan, you started this, maybe you want to discuss how the NEPA process parses that out, and those two things are separate, because it's hard for me to figure that out.
Jim, fair to put me on the spot. But I think the nuance of my comment is that, you're absolutely right. On one hand, we need a good baseline. That is one of the fundamental bullet points of the BOEM guidance, is to create a defensible and complete as possible baseline of the lease area before construction starts, before impact. And and there have been a diversity of approaches to establishing that baseline. So that I think is there. Where we are maybe at a scope creep is, are we equivocating that baseline ability with what Stephen, what you were bringing up, and what others who are involved in the SSTs and how we go about defining, population and species management. That's a whole nother rich area of effort and models and 60+ year time series of catch data from fishery independent and dependent sources. They really are truly apples and oranges, and how we got to defensible numbers for each of those is a very different problem set. It's a very different scope and scale. And I think my feeling is, are we, just to raise the discussion of how we first were looking at, which I agreed with, we were first looking at individual lease area impacts, and then we recognized, oh, well, those might be different if we look at them in total or in a regional area. So we started looking at cumulative impacts. So like I don't think there's a black and white answer here, but I just think that keeping front of mind the scale and purpose of each data set is a valuable exercise, because I think it could limit misinformation. I think it could limit scope creep, if you will. I think it could help make some efficiencies for all parties. So I think there's benefit to having that discussion, and we always look to BOEM and NEMS and the regulatory agencies for that guidance. So there's another tension that we have in this space. And BOEM is looking at, there's a very, it feels very dynamic. It feels very different than answering just a fisheries question or just answering a permitting question. I think we're on the scale, and knowing our point of beginning is essential to knowing, where the endpoints are. And that's, I don't know if that helps confuse or clarify, Jim, but the real point is, we would never manage a fisheries on NEPA level permitting data. It's just not, it has all the flaws that we're talking about. But I don't also think that we should have an expectation that data fit that more complex purpose that I'm sometimes hearing, or I'm interpreting that I'm hearing in some of the conversations that are going about writ large.
Dan, I mean, I completely agree that you don't collect data without fully understanding how the questions you're asking and how it's going to be used. So I appreciate that. There's a question about eDNA that was put forth. Oh, sorry, Ron, I didn't see. So are you okay to hold off?
Yeah, I could hold off.
Thanks. Oh, I don't see the eDNA question. Caroline, do you have it?
Yes, I still have it. Yes. So another question from Tim Sipple that kind of goes into our conversation a little bit. He said perhaps eDNA sampling could be coupled with these new methods to provide another information source to calibrate and estimate errors in old/new estimates. So maybe a comment more than a question, but if anyone wants to reply to it, please feel free.
I'll jump in and just say that it's a really active and interesting point of research. We are aware that, and Brian, I don't know if you can want to speak to this, but there are efforts at collecting eDNA on a regional basis in the New York Bight and the Massachusetts wind energy area. And there's a national strategy now that came out in June of this year, that was the whole of government approach to eDNA. So to Tim Sippel's question, I think it's absolutely on our horizon and imminent, you know, and having it be a supporting line of evidence is I think a really promising approach. Will it replace some kind of extractive sampling technology? I have doubts that it'll be trusted in the near term.
But I think like the question to me, why that's interesting is can you combine these non-lethal methods to get to a point of reliability that is comparable to like the traditional surveying methods? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know what it would take to do it, but I think it's an interesting question where you're not just using, one non-lethal approach, but a combination of these different technologies and approaches. And I don't know if the expense of that makes it cost prohibitive, like you're combining all these different things.
We'll go to Ron unless somebody else has a comment about the eDNA. Okay, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, the Coonamessett Farm Foundation had a eDNA project that Lise was lead on. I think we have a long way to go before we could be successfully applying it. My point I want to make about monitoring programs, I don't see them like stock assessment programs, developing long-term databases that come up with accurate annual stock assessments. I see them more like a doctor's visit. You go to the doctor for your annual physical, he runs some standard tests, and if something's wrong, then an action is taken. And that's what bothered me yesterday about the croaker thing. Okay, all of a sudden the monitoring program put in place for another reason, the protected species monitoring, finds something's going on. There needs to be a rapid response using the correct tools, the correct people to investigate what's going on. It's just like the whale issue off of New Jersey. The public doesn't believe a government person that gets out and says that we have no evidence now that the wind farms are causing the problem. That's a non-answer. We had fishermen report beds of we call clappers, dead scallops, and you would think there would be, okay, there's a bed of dead scallops. It's in an area that the fishermen say are being carpet bombed by seismic profiling. We have some evidence that seismic sub-bottom profiling can cause harm or have an impact on scallops. What's the process to be able to get out and investigate something that a monitoring program turns up? There was no money. We had to go out on our own dime to investigate what was going on. But I think we need to look at these monitoring programs from a different perspective. They're basically the annual doctor's visit. It's the system that tells us there's something going on that we need to investigate, and we need to have those standard methods to investigate the different potential impacts that might occur. I had asked, okay, you see some dead juvenile and adult croaker, who's out there doing the plankton tows to see if larval fish are being impacted by whatever? So that all should be pre-planned and set up ahead of time. Thanks.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe this is a good opportunity, Brian, to talk about where BOEM ends and where Bessie starts, and whether Bessie would be that role that Ron's talking about, or is it within your purview at BOEM? Maybe that's also a nice thing to sort of collaborate or elaborate on for the group.
Yeah, sure. And as we talked a little bit about yesterday, I think the reason that we're having that conversation yesterday is that, we're trying to formulate, an understanding of what was causing that to then therefore, where do we put our energy to being able to figure that out? BOEM doesn't, or Bessie doesn't have assets like at the ready, at the dock, ready to be deployed. We depend on contracting mechanisms to develop something, and those take time and a budget. Our environmental studies budget isn't always have money at the ready. It's usually tied up in projects. Matter of fact, I think it would be looked down on if we had like some type of kitty of money that was just available. So those are usually allocated on an annual basis, and it takes time, unfortunately, to be able to put some of these projects in place to do further investigation, to better understand the cause. As far as like where Bessie comes in, Bessie definitely is the lead on that operations and the decommissioning side of things. But it's still BOEM that is responsible for a lot of the environmental analyses to support, and BOEM has the environmental studies program in its purview under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. So a lot of that still depends on BOEM to support Bessie in some of its analyses and in studies as well. So what Bessie can do is like what we've seen this summer is like they can put a stop work order in place and say, hold on, stop what you're doing. We need to figure this out, and then BOEM can support that from in other ways, like in an environmental review of what happened. And then I think, Jim, to you did have a previous question, regarding short-term and long-term. And inherently, I think, when we're talking on the scale of, 3 to 5 years is what we're looking at for a lot of what the lessees are doing. I would consider that short-term. But this is where the standardization comes in, and we do have that opportunity perhaps to think of it as being long-term, because we do have, even as Lisa described earlier in her presentation, you have, the South Fork wind farm, it's built and operating. You have Revolution wind farm, which is actively under construction. And then you have Sunrise, which is still, a little bit further behind Revolution wind. So each one of those has some type of monitoring component associated with them. So you do expand, you get closer to a long-term data set when you look at it across the projects as they come online and in time. And if they're using similar methodologies, you might be able to do some of those bigger picture things, even though that what Dan and even Ron said, those doctor visits are the purpose of those individually are to look at the project. But I think a lot of people, myself included, see like, there's advantages if that information can be used to paint that bigger, either regional picture or longer time series picture. So yeah, there's a challenge in trying to ensure that we're communicating effectively that this is what the requirements are, but we want to build a system that people can use that data for potentially other things, but that's not the requirement. That's kind of a nice to have that we're hoping to build some consensus around.
Right. Great. Thank you for all the questions and discussion. We had pretty lively discussion here already. I'll give it, if there's any final questions about kind of the topic that we're on before we go to a little bit of a break before our next session. Anything else from the committee or public? Jim, any final comment, thoughts as chair before we take a break?
No, I just want to thank everybody and Lise for your presentation. I thought it was a great conversation. And thanks, Brian, for your contributions.
All right, with that, we will take about a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 2:40 for our discussions on larval disbursement, settlement, and connectivity modeling.
Thank you, Caroline.
Almost 12:40. Right. And with that, it is 2:40 Eastern Time, and we are back from our short break, ready for the next set of presentations. And first, we will go to Nikitas Georges from Tetra Tech to give your presentation, and you are sharing your own screen, correct? Okay, perfect.
That's right, Caroline. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Let me, from a logistics perspective, how much time do we have? We have about a 15-minute presentation with Listel from PNNL. Does that sound right?
Yes, that's perfect. We have scheduled 15-minute presentation for you, and then for the group from DHI, and then an hour for Q&A. So if it goes a little bit long, that's
Okay,
that
perfect. Now let's see if this works. Can you see my screen yet, or?
Not yet. It was running a little slow this morning or earlier today.
I think we might have to go with your presentation,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Yep. Safa, can you pull up? Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Sorry about that. So thanks everyone very much for joining. My name is Nikitas Georgias. I'm an oceanographer and principal scientist and the Metocean lead for RPS Ocean Sciences, which is now part of Tetra Tech. I also co-lead the climate resiliency practice for water in Tetra Tech. And I manage this BOEM project on the impact of offshore wind development on oceanographic processes in the Mid-Atlantic Bight from Cape Hatteras to Long Island. The project was funded by BESI for BOEM, and it has been a collaboration between RPS Ocean Sciences and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. RPS was leading the oceanography part, and PNNL was leading the individual-based modeling larval transport part. My presenters with co-authors are Mahmoud Monim, Emily Day, and Dan Koliga from RPS. Dan is also here to answer questions on our part. And then Lily Angel, Lene Hemery, and Lisa Caravelli from PNL. Lisa is going to be presenting with me. And I think I saw Lily also in the attendees. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure the committee knows, there has been emerging scientific literature on the potential impacts of offshore wind development to ocean circulations and fisheries. This literature includes the former DHI work that was published in 2021 with Tom's work and the NASA publication in 2004, this year, for the Nantucket Shoals area. Just a recoup of what is known generally speaking. Offshore wind turbines extract wind energy and they reduce wind speeds downstream. This deficit compounded over the scale of a wind farm from multiple wind turbines or across multiple wind farms is generally called a wind wake. You can see a picture on the right, top right, as an example from wind farms in Europe, from Dorenkamp and Steinfeld. The red is the free-flowing wind field at about 9 meters per second, and reductions of the lee side of the wind farm shown with other colors, yellow and so on. Synthetic aperture radar and LiDAR studies are conducted to measure the wakes, but there have been none, as far as I know, for the 15 megawatt turbines that are to be put into the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And now Canadillas et al. With LiDAR and Christiansen et al. With SAR observed similar reductions of winds in the German Bight. In Australia, multiple work has been done in terms of the already existing wind farms and the wind wakes they produce. Now, since the surface wind stress is reduced, surface waves may be impacted as well as surface currents, and therefore anything that is transported by those currents, including larvae. Currents may also be impacted on a local wind turbine scale through turbine foundation resistance, flow separation, and so on. Horizontal stress diverges at the edges of the wind wakes may create upwelling and downwelling dipoles, so a lot of vertical motion. As winds change, convective and sensible air sieve heat fluxes may change, and mixing and certification, impacting sea surface temperatures, but also vertical density distributions, and a doming effect on the pycnocline or thermocline in the map. And over the shelf, changes in waves may impact sediment mobility. And since circulation may be impacted, there may be impacts to larval transport and fisheries, which is part of what we're looking at here. Next slide, please. So our project used extensively validated numerical modeling to evaluate the effects of proposed offshore wind developments over the Mid-Atlantic Bight, basically from an area from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina to Long Island. And 3 scenarios were evaluated. Scenario 1 is the one that we call baseline without wind turbines. Scenario 2 is a partial or limited build-out of wind farms at around 30 gigawatts total development, consisting 1,852 wind turbine generators as presently planned with COPs. And scenario 3, which we call the full build-out at about 95 gigawatts, consists 6,353 turbines with configuration specs that were provided by BOEM on a 0.6 nautical mile by 0.6 nautical mile grid within the wind farms. And on the map on the right of this slide, areas with development scenario 2 are shown in blue. And scenario 3 expands this to include the yellow areas covering all of the shown wind energy areas. All turbines placed are based, as I said before, on the very large 15 megawatt NREL wind turbines with 150 meters hub height, 240 meters rotor diameter, 10 meters monopile diameter, and 3 to 25 meters per second cut-in and cut-off speeds, respectively. Those are the specs we had for all the turbines that we used in our modeling. And of course, there will be deviations in practice. Next slide, please. So several approaches were reviewed in how to simulate these wakes, from WRF modeling and CFD to engineering wake models. And for our research, we opted to use the Python-based PyWake model from the Technical University of Denmark. It's a free software used also in other similar studies, including the one Tom will be talking about from DHI after me. PyWake takes account of each wind turbine generator's, each wind turbine's physical dimensions and design specs, including any sort of curves for energy harvesting and their placement within each wind farm. It outputs the downstream wind wave deficits, accounting for turbine to turbine and farm to farm interactions based on engineering wind deficit models. And several such engineering models are included in PyWake, some of which, 4 of them, are shown on the right. And each of the 4 deficit models that are displayed for 6 meters per second wind. That's yellow, the yellow color, coming from the east and interacting with a wind farm with multiple turbines. As an example, the blue to green shadow is the wake deficit, and the highest deficits at the hub height occur just downstream of the turbines, as you see, with kind of like bluish color within the wind farm, with recovery further downstream to free-flowing wind speed. In this specific approach, we selected and used the Turbo Gaussian, the bottom right model from Pedersen et al., which was published in 2022 and was adopted by several researchers since. It is more conservative, as you can see. It creates longer and stronger wind deficits and has been found to better reflect deficits from wind wake clusters. Next slide, please. So we have a report that should be coming out in the beginning of 2025 for BOEM, and about half of that report is validation of the model. So be aware that there's going to be a lot of validation discussion in the model. So it was a validated numerical model that we used to calculate the impact of the wind wake clusters, as well as the flow of blockage from the monopiles to the original hydrodynamics of the Mid-Atlantic Bight. We applied the DEL3D FM structured hydrodynamic model and the SWAN surface wave model. So waves and currents in 3D on a common grid from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, that you can see here, to Montauk, Long Island, including the self break, and the deep ocean plateau. The triangular finite element grid that you see on the left and the continental self bathymetry that you see on the right use the common unstructured finite element grid with highest resolution in the wind farm areas in the WEAs to allow for each turbine to be in its own finite element. And then for the vertical, we use a hybrid sigma zeta vertical segmentation with 40 vertical layers for the model grid. In terms of forcing, we nested these models within the ROMS Doppio data simulative model of the Northeast Atlantic and used waves and surface forcing for wind and heat flux related variables from the ERA5 reanalysis. And we ran these models for 2 years, from February 2018 to January 2020 inclusive, and looked at our result. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, PyWake was the model that we used to calculate wind deficits with Gaussian for various wind speeds and direction beams across independent clusters. So for each cluster of wind farms in the Mid-Atlantic Bight, we had directions and speeds and deficits calculated. And those results provided hourly deficits and reduced surface wind fields based on the instantaneous wind speed and directions for each cluster. And this approach that we used captured the special wind variability over the domain to the level of the wind cluster, as well as overlapping wake effects when the wakes extended downstream to other wind farms. Now, the color maps that you see here show the PyWake calculated wind deficits over the Mid-Atlantic Bight, from yellow being 0 deficit to blue being about 2 meters per second wind speed over the mean. So this, the maximum deficits, as you can see, the red arrows are showing the prevailing wind directions over the summertime. And the maps are also for the summertime over 6 months of 6 summer months that we did over the 2 years averaged. So the deficits can be seen mostly directed along the prevailing wind direction, and they reach about 20% of the median winds within the farms, but can be up to 30 to 50%, 1% of the time throughout the summer period. The wake footprints themselves can be seen to extend 50 to 200 kilometers on certain days, so quite long wakes. And given that farm-to-farm interactions are captured, and you can see here scenario 3, which is the one to the right, the full build-out has the highest reductions. And they seem to be more pronounced, the ones we calculate here, compared to the ones from Golbasi et al. That is usually used in the literature to kind of figure out whether your calculations are validating. Golbasi et al. Used the 4-kilometer wharf model with the wind turbine and wind wake parameterization, and they had different configurations, 10 megawatt turbines, not 15 megawatt turbines, and only simulated the summer of 2018. The deficit contours that you see are the 0.5 meter per second deficit contours from our PyWake applications, which are shown in cyan, while the ones from Golbasi et al. Are shown in magenta. And the PyWake approach for the 15 megawatt turbines that we used here definitely predicts that mean surface wind reductions of 0.5 meter per second reach downstream farms, as you can see in the summer period in the northern farms of the domain under full build-out conditions. So they do affect downstream farms based on the modeling that we used. Next slide, please. Now, we use the reduced hourly wind fields in our 3D hydrodynamic models and the surface wave models, along with the other boundary forces and the hydrodynamic drag from the monopiles, and simulated 2 years of conditions. Surface wave results will only be summarized for brevity because I don't have time for all of it at the end of this presentation. And we'll basically focus mostly on the currents here, which transport these larvae. So although reductions in the total currents that include tides are also documented, and you can see them, the median and 95th percentile long self-tidal residual currents, so the mean circulation, tends to increase in our model with the wind farms. And the 4 central maps here show the simulated annual mean depth average current. Even though we did 3D, this is the depth average result over the self for the baseline and full build out in 2 zoom levels. The zoom level on the bottom is higher, so you can see a little bit closer to the WEAs. There's a well-known mid-Atlantic bight southward flow that's very well known in the literature, and it's captured by the model. And there are no visual, if you look at them, at this central panel of figures very closely, it's to the naked eye, they seem very similar. But when you look closer, you do see that the arrows and magnitudes change of the mean current, mostly around the isobaths where the WAs are located. And the map on the far right shows the vector difference, not the mean speed or the 95th percentile of speed, which is a positive quantity, but the vector difference of the tidal residual currents between scenario 3 and baseline. So the red area shows strengthening of the known depth average tidal residual currents or mean circulation to the south, up to about 1 centimeter per second, while the blue areas show these currents weakening to a lesser degree, though, as you can see in the terms of coloring. That rightmost image may imply shear production also on either side of the WEAs, but the general circulation pattern remains, as you can see on the central panel, always to the south. Next slide, please. Now, our study finds that the dominant process in the expected change is not the monopile drag or the hydrodynamic drag from bridge pilings that we put into DOT3D, but the loss of surface wind stress from the wind wakes. And as compared to the localized expected increase in the mixing from the monopile foundations that has been documented in literature on a regional wind farm scale, we're simulating less mixing, increasing water column stability, more stratified waters on the wind farm, around the wind farms, and some possible changes in upwelling and downwelling dynamics. So the left mark here shows the simulated thermal stratification for August 2018 in the model domain, ranging between about 2 degrees Celsius at shallower coast to 24 degrees top to bottom temperature difference in the Gulf Stream and Deep Oceanic Plateau. And the stratified waters of the cold pool that you can see over the mid-Atlantic bight are seen in the model as well. Now, the 2 figures on the right, they show with red increases in thermal top to bottom stratification in the wind farms. And this increase in top to bottom stratification reaches up to 1 degree Celsius in August 2018, which is our maximum that we had in terms of monthlies. There's a lot of that in the report in terms of monthly pictures and a time series and so on. A lot of information there. Next slide, please. So in terms of the summary of results for the oceanographic processes, the wind turbines cause wind wake deficits, especially for wind speeds between 3 and 11 meters per second, given the turbines that we simulated with PyWake. Within wind farms and tens of kilometers downwind, you can detect those wind wakes all the way up to 200 kilometers certain days. Up to 2% reduction of average winds at 10-meter height is seen, but with a maximum of 30 to 50% reduction 1% of the time. This is at hub height. And the resulting surface wave changes as the stress is reduced. And this is the only statement on wind waves, are relatively minor. Okay, so wind waves are not much affected much. They're mostly local to the farms and effects stronger for farms aligned with the wind, the same way that wind is reduced. The heights are only reduced about half a foot and about 5% of the local reduction. And the periods are lengthened somewhat, but only about 0.15 seconds, as well is propagated more than the wind waves that are reduced more. Now we have changes to the typical 2 to 12 centimeter per second southward mean circulation alongside tidal residual currents in the mid-Atlantic Bight. And the wind deficit causes up to 1 centimeter per second increase in southward alongshore residual flow along the WAs, as showed in the model, and changes the wind balancing as the wind is reduced. It's changing the wind balancing the regional southward alongshore pressure gradient that is known to Bight. There are 3 papers that came out in the 2024, this year actually, that speak about what you expect if the wind is reduced and how that can actually accelerate the residual flow in the Mid-Atlantic Bight. Reduced wind-driven vertical mixing affects the water column. We see doming of the thermocline, especially on the lee side of WEAs. In the report, there's a discussion there. Summer stratification increases up to 1 degree Celsius strongest. 0.25 degrees Celsius seasonal surface warming is simulated within the WEAs, and possible changes in upwelling and downwelling. While we're also discussing the cold pool dynamics, the seasonal evolution is not modified. And we also looked at heat fluxes, and I'll just save that for when you actually read the report or for questions. Next slide, please. And this is where I hand off to Lisa from PNNL to talk to you about the larval transport modeling of this work.
Thank you. And let us know how much time we have left. I can accelerate if needed. And you can click for time if you don't mind. Yeah, again, here we go. Thank you. So to assess the potential effects of the wind energy areas on the larval dynamics of commercial species, we developed a biophysical larval dispersal model using the outputs from the RPS hydrodynamic model that Nikita has just presented as inputs into an individual base model called ICCHOP. So the output from the hydrodynamic model are current velocities, directions, and temperature that we use in ICCHOP. And in ICCHOP, we are able to add larval processes such as the behavior or survival of the larvae. And from this coupling, we can know the position of each larva at each time step. So we run the model for the 3 hydrodynamic scenarios that Nikita has presented: the baseline, partial, and full built-out wind energy areas. Today, we are only showing the results for Atlantic sea scallop larvae, and 10,000 larvae were released every month in the model during the spawning period of the species, and we ran the model for 2018 and 2019. And you can see at the bottom here, the 11 spawning areas that we define along the Mid-Atlantic Bight. So they are in green on the maps at the bottom, with the wind energy areas in yellow for each scenario on top of it. And the larvae in the model were released from each of these spawning areas. Next slide, please. So this video shows one release event on May 14, 2018 for Atlantic sea scallop larvae to demonstrate how the currents in the larval dispersal model transport the larvae. The larval dispersal duration is set at 45 days in the models. This is based on data that we gathered on the biology of the larvae. And here what we show in this configuration, the larvae were passive, meaning there is no diel vertical migration behavior included in the model. So as you can see on the video that larvae are mainly transported from north to south. Sometimes larvae disappear from the video, And this means that they exited the model boundary and are considered lost. And the successfully settled larvae, they stop moving in the video. Next slide, please. So now we're going to show you some results. You can click one more and there is, yes, thank you. So now we're going to show you some results from our larval dispersal model. And this first plot shows the larval settlement success in each settlement zone, which what I didn't say is that we consider the spawning and settlement zone to be the same in the model. And we have here each modeling scenario from left to right, basin, partial, and full build out. So the maps on the top row are for model configuration with passive larvae, and the bottom row is for when diel vertical migration is included in the model. And the settlement success here is the number of larvae that settled in each zone, and this is normalized to the total number of larvae released, and it's average over all release events, including 2018 and 2019. So for the passive larvae, the plot on the left without energy areas shows a higher larval settlement success in the northern part of the domain. And you can see also a hotspot of larval settlement in zone 3, so 1 to 3 starting from the top. And the maximum settlement success is around 1%. So you see 0.95% that is circled in red. The second and third plots on the top here, there are the differences between scenario 2 and 3, so partial and full build out wind energy area, differences between these two scenarios and the first plot. And positive changes are in red and negative changes are in blue. You can see that including the partial wind energy areas leads to an increase of larval settlement in zones 3 to 7 and a decrease in the surrounding areas, suggesting the larvae are transported toward the middle of the study domain when wind energy areas are included. And this is further exaggerated in the scenario 3 on the right, with the highest increase observed in zone 5. So now when we included the behavior in the model, so the bottom maps here, you can see that the maximum settlement success increases to around 6%. And this is because diel vertical migration forces the larvae to stay closer to the surface, and there is less larval mortality in the model. And the highest settlement success is still in the northern part of the model, but now the hotspot of the settlement is in zone 5. And with wind energy areas, once again, larval settlement increases in the middle areas with losses around, but the hotspot here, you can see on the right, is further south. Next slide, please. You can click again, I guess. Thank you. So this plot is a connectivity matrix, and the x-axis represents the release zone of the larvae, and the y-axis is the settlement zone of the larvae. So it's really like you can go from the release zone and you go up, and you can see like where the larvae release from. If we look at zone 4, you can see where the larvae released from zone 4 were settled. And we can get the information on where successfully settled larvae are coming from. So if we look at the passive configuration, for now at the top, we notice a hotspot of larval connectivity in the north, and larvae settling in zone 3, for example, tend to come from zones 1, 2, and 3. And for scenario 2 and 3, we see that there is a decrease in local retention in zones 2 and 3. This is the boxes that you see along the diagonal. And we can also see some increases in larval connectivity in different areas. So it's very patchy, very different depending on the area. And you can see here that the effects of wind energy areas on larval connectivity vary strongly with location and scenario. In scenario 3, there are some localized patches of loss. In the northern part of the domain, particularly larvae that were released in zones 4 to 7 had less successful settlement when we have the wind energy areas. And when we look at the bottom maps, so this is a configuration with diel vertical migration. The hotspot of connectivity is stronger, but still there in the north. And the wind energy areas have a more positive influence on the connectivity overall here. When we include behavior, we can also see that the increases and decreases of connectivity are more concentrated, less patchy, with behavior than in the passive model, but there is a greater increase when we have the full build out. Next slide. So just summary of our results for larvae. The general trends on the effects of wind energy area is that there is a decrease of local retention in the north. I didn't show the results here, but we noticed an increase in larval dispersal distances. And overall, this is not statistically different between the areas along the mid-Atlantic bight. We noticed some connectivity hotspots in the northern region for Atlantic scallop that persisted with wind energy areas. But the effects of wind energy areas, we saw that they are very location dependent. And as I mentioned, larval behavior influences larval dynamic with and without the presence of wind energy areas. So there is a bigger effect of the hydrodynamics overall. And we also did this study for other species, Atlantic surf clam and black sea bass, and we also see similarly mixed responses to wind energy areas. And this is Nikitas will end this talk. Thank you.
Yes, I just put here with PNL some possible next steps for this work. For time's sake, maybe we can skip this and we'll leave it for discussion, but we're thinking about more years in the variability, instead of just 2 years, different species potentially, and so on. And then the other 2 slides that I'm sure can be shared later, have to do with acknowledgements for Boehm, Bessie, Noah Nims, Crimsopharnidis was in our discussions, and then Deltaras and DTU, the Technical University of Denmark, and the next slide, I think, is the literature in case anybody is interested in diving more. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nikitas and Liesl, for the presentation and what very in-depth information. Real quickly, I will see if the committee has any just factual type questions. Otherwise, we will save more kind of discussion-based questions until after we hear the next presentation. So any quick questions from the committee? Does not look like it right now. Okay. All right. We will move on and we'll bring you guys back on for the discussion a little bit later, but we'll turn it over to Tom and Ellie from DHI.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I will make apologies for Ellie. She is ill and she's in the UK for Christmas holiday, so it's kind of late for her. So she went to bed.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Just to go over the agenda, I know we're kind of short on time. Going to go through mostly agent-based model results, or as Nikitas and Liesl said, was individual-based model, same thing. We're going to go through the conclusions, recommendations for further study, and acknowledgements. Go ahead to the next slide. Next slide. So the background, very similar to what the Tetra Tech study and PNNL went through. We were tasked to look at North Carolina to New York. When we did a previous study that included Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So we had a model previously. We decided to expand the model since we had done something similar for another project from Nova Scotia down to Florida, so that we could include the Georgia and South Carolina wind energy areas, as well as repeat the study for the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. And we also then can include Georges Banks, Gulf of Maine, and connectivity with those areas. We did study similar species. We studied Atlantic sea scallop, Atlantic surf clam, but instead of the black sea bass, we did summer flounder. This study builds upon previous work that we did at DHI, but also Chen et al. In 2016. And like I said, we've increased the model domain to include bigger area, which also then allows us to include the Gulf Stream quite substantially in the study area. Next slide, please. So we had basically 6 scenarios or 5 scenarios, but the 6th scenario is just multiple years. Similar to the Tetra Tech study, we started with baseline. We did 12 megawatt and 15 megawatt partial build outs. Those are the with COP scenarios. So the yellow on the slide or the graphic on the right. And then full build out scenarios 4 and 5, we did 12 megawatts and 15 megawatts. You can see the number of wind turbine generators for each of these scenarios. What we're going to discuss today is scenario 6, which was a 3-year, and we looked at 3 years and 3 spawning years, basically. So we looked at Atlantic sea scallops for these 3 years of 2017, 18, and 2020. Move on to the next slide, please. So, and like I said, we're going to focus on the ABM results or the agent-based modeling results, but basically our models were very similar to, the hydrodynamic model is very similar to what was deployed by Tetra Tech. We use the DHI Mike 3 FM HD model. We also use the Mike 21 spectral wave model, although those results we're not going to present today. Reynolds average and Navier-Stokes model, which include wind shear stress, effect on currents, tidal currents, salinity, viscosity, heat exchange. And then when we went to the wind turbine generators, for the wind wake, we used, basically we used the same model, PyWake, to calculate the changes in the wind field due to the wind turbine generators, which changes the wind shear stress at the sea surface. And then subsurface, each turbine had its own, implemented as a subgrid feature. Again, similar to what Tetra Tech did, where we looked at, the drag force as a momentum sink, and we had a source term for turbulent kinetic energy for the extra production of the wake inside this the RANS model. And then we increased the eddy viscosity to added mixing momentum and for temperature and salinity. So I think basically we have equivalent models between the two for the hydrodynamics and the wind turbine generators, which is good for comparison's sake. Input data, all sorts of different bathymetric data, meteorological data. Instead of ERA5, we use CFSR, climate forecast, system reanalysis. Our oceanographic data, instead of Doppio, we used HICOM for the global circulation model. We used our own tide model, DTU10, for the astronomical tide. We had river discharge from the USGS for 36 major rivers that was included. And then the boundary conditions go back to HICOM and the DTU tidal model. Could you go on to the next slide, please? So next, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the agent-based modeling. Next slide. There you go. So I'm hoping, but maybe for those who are unfamiliar with agent-based modeling or ABM, it's a computational model for simulating actions and interactions of autonomous super agents or agents. In this case, an agent is a fish or a shellfish larva. And what we're going to discuss today is the Atlantic sea scallop results for the 3 years, as I said. Agent behavior in our model is governed by algorithms and equations based on known behavioral traits of the organisms of interest, and that's including spawning, growth, and development time, vertical movement in response to temperature, for instance, horizontal movement, and then preferred settlement habitat. So we've included these behaviors, including these behaviors allows for us a more accurate simulation than what can be achieved with just a passive drift or particle tracking model, where you just have a constant fall velocity. So the ABM was coupled to the hydrodynamic model, and agent movement was influenced by the currents, temperatures, depth, and substrate type. Move on to the next slide. So like I said, the 3 species were modeled, including sea scallop, surf clam, and summer flounder. In the interest of time, we're only going to present the sea scallop model results here. If you're interested in the results of the other species, you're going to have to look at our report once it's published. And similar to what Nikita said, we expect the report to be published by BOEM sometime early in 2025. Could you move on to the next slide, please? So this slide provides an overview of the modeling steps First, we customized 3 different ABM templates by identifying relevant behavioral responses and associated state variables needed for each species. Next, the ABM is coupled to the hydrodynamic model to allow for larval agents to sense and to react to the physical environment, including current direction, speed, temperature, etc., in time and space. We then run the ABM multiple times and aggregate the results to produce settlement maps. Could you go on to the next slide, please? So to customize and set up each ABM template, specific life cycle, spawning, movement, and settlement traits are programmed in. The sea scallop model begins at the zygote phase and develops through the trochophore. And I'm not a biologist, so if I mispronounce this, you can correct me later. Villager and pedivillager phases. The time taken to reach each stage is based on literature and sampled randomly from a distribution of possible time periods. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Spawning is simulated randomly, releasing zygotes from the areas shown. The start and duration of spawning is based on the available literature in each of these different regions. There are different timings for different regions, hence 4 separate spawning regions are shown. The red is Gulf of Maine, the dark blue is Georges Banks, and then offshore, Long Island, and then the Delmarva, New Jersey area. The number of agents released is based on biomass estimates for each area, so that we get, kind of a relative amount of agents from each of these areas. Next slide, please. So each larval stage has different movement behaviors built in. Once larvae become pre-competent and they haven't reached settlement age yet, they can move vertically in the water column in response to temperature. Once they become competent, they have the ability to swim down to suitable substrate and to settle. Next slide, please. Within each species ABM is a settlement suitability map. These are based on the USGS substrate maps, and each substrate type is given a weighting according to the species preference for settlement within that substrate. On the left, you can see the substrate map developed for sea scallop compared to the USGS sediment map on the right. Red and orange areas on the suitability map are most suitable substrates for settlement and have a higher score. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, we use an ensemble approach. This ensemble approach offers the ability to manage model uncertainty and to increase the robustness of model results. Initial conditions and inputs on the model were kept the same, meaning like the same hydrodynamic forcings, time periods, number of larvae spawned, and larva behavior are the same for each model simulations within each ensemble. However, agents were released from within the designated spawning areas randomly. Other variables were sampled randomly from within a normal distribution of a range of feasible values found in literature, like incubation time for eggs to hatch, larval development time to reach competency, and mortality rates. So you can see here in the plot that after 20 to 25 simulations, the standard error of the results starts to converge. And that indicates that the increasing number of ensembles won't further improve the results anymore. So the ensemble size of 25 clones was chosen. The other thing that I guess I should point out is, we have somewhere between 25 and 30,000 super agents released within each spawning area randomly, and each super agent was representative of something like 50 million zygotes, depending on the fecundity of the species. So the number of agents in the end that we were tracking is in very, very, very high numbers. Next slide, please. Next one. So here we have baseline results with no wind farms for sea scallops for 2017. It's difficult to validate these results due to data limitations, survey extents, that sort of thing. And because settlement does not necessarily equal recruitment. In other words, settled larvae aren't guaranteed to survive and mature, and therefore areas of higher settlement than biomass are not necessarily incorrect. However, the results do show good agreement with the essential fish habitat, which is the white line, and the biomass data, which are the orange points, And when we were in this phase of calibration and validation, we consulted with Dr. Daphne Monroe at Rutgers to review the results, and she came back and said they looked fairly good to her. So you can see that the greatest settlement densities are offshore in New Jersey, Long Island, and further south through the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area, or the Delmarva region, where the purple color is the most dense. Next slide, please. So once the wind farms were included in the hydrodynamic model, we could then assess the changes in current speed from baseline conditions. So here the current speed change resulting from the 15 megawatt full build out scenario is shown. There are clear changes in current speed. Blue indicates a decrease in speed, red an increase in current speed resulting from the offshore wind farms. But they're no more than something like plus or minus 0.025 meters per second or 2.5 centimeters per second in depth average current change. So there is, however, no clear direct spatial correlation between changes in the larval settlement and the areas of current speeds increase and decrease. But changes in settlement were shown in the model results for all three species. So the next slide, please. So on this slide, the left plot shows the difference in settlement between the baseline and 2017 scenario for sea scallops. I know it's a very big area and it's hard to see, but red indicates an increase in settlement and blue is a decrease in settlement. So these results are really quite noisy. So we used a cluster analysis called DB scan, and I think the explanation of what DB scan stands for is in the on this slide. I can't read it right now. But anyway, we use DB scan to highlight hotspots of change, and that's what's shown on the right. You can see that changes in the settlement, both decreases and increases, are concentrated in the New Jersey and Delmarva regions and extend beyond the wind energy areas. Areas of decreased settlement are also found in and around wind energy areas 5 and 6, which are kind of our labels, to the north of the New Jersey region and along the coast of Delaware, where near wind energy area 8 and 9, again numbered for our purposes. There are also areas of increased settlement in the central area closer to New Jersey shore, continuing south into the Delmarva region. So we divided the coast into smaller destination areas, the black lines, and it's interesting to note the context of these changes in settlement. The average changes in sea scallop settlement, decrease or increase, within a destination area are four orders of magnitude lower than the total settlement in that destination area. So the changes are quite small, as witnessed by that. Could you move on to the next slide, please? So we also modeled the changes in sea scallop settlement for years 2017, 2018, and 2020. And this is a swarm plot. This slide shows a swarm plot where every point on this plot is one model run from the ensemble of 25 runs. The colors represent the different scenarios, either baseline or full 15 megawatt full build out for the 3 years. Along the x-axis, we have the most common destination areas. NJ equals New Jersey, LI, Long Island, DMV, Delmarva. There's an interannual variability between 2017, 2018, and 2020 model years with different hotspots of increase or decrease within New Jersey, but the overall patterns are the same, i.e. changes are found mainly in New Jersey and are of the same order of magnitude and are around the same wind energy areas and other areas. So for example, if you're looking at the second destination area, NJ7, in 2018 sits below 2017 and 2020. The red and the green points. The red points are the baseline result, and the green points are the 15 megawatt full build out. They're mixed together, those red and green points, indicating that there's little change in settlement in this destination area between baseline and 15 megawatt full build out for 2018. 2017, however, at the top, pink and green points show a reduction in settlement once the wind farms are introduced. This decrease in settlement, however, is small when considering the interannual variability of the number of individuals that settle in the area and the vertical spread between the different swarms. I know this is a difficult plot perhaps to get your mind around really quickly, but once you do, it's quite an interesting way to look at these ensemble results and compare, changes and differences. Move on to slide 21, please. So in summary, sea scallop settlement changes occur primarily in the New Jersey region and extend through Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Average changes in settlement per destination area for sea scallop are 4 orders of magnitude lower than the total settlement within a destination area. There is interannual variability between 2017 and 2018 and 2020, with slightly different hotspots of increased or decreased settlement, but the overall patterns of settlement and settlement change are the same. Changes in settlement due to the offshore wind farms appear to be small in comparison to interannual variability in settlement. Could you move on to the next slide, please? Next slide. So conclusions and relevance. So hotspots of settlement increase and decrease are hotspots of settlement increase and decrease are identified in areas where there are harvest efforts. Over the entire modeling domain, these differences are small, but persistent over the life of the projects, which may be 30 years. It's noted that settlement does not necessarily equal recruitment, and unknowns regarding post-settlement survival contribute to uncertainty in estimating recruitment in most marine fisheries. The relevance of these findings to recruitment will depend on growth and survival beyond settlement. It's not likely that the model changes in settlement will lead to measurable declines in landings. This is our opinion of sea scallops over the region. However, spatial persistence of the changes may be relevant to local scale patches of sea scallops and any local fisheries they may support. Next slide, please. Next, there you go. So we have several recommendations for further study and could build on this work, and that includes localized analysis. First is to develop area and species-specific impact threshold limits for acceptability of change in larval settlement to help put these results into context and extend the ABM analysis for juvenile stages of target species development to allow for the impacts on recruitment to be better understood. Second, use or collect dedicated local observational data and knowledge, plus localized and more temporarily refined ABM results post-processing for the New Jersey Delmarva areas to better understand the model changes in settlement. And it's suggested that the monitoring surveys could be focused in the hotspot areas identified in the study to increase the data available and impacts to be better understood. And lastly, inclusion of the artificial reef effect could be considered as monopiles and their scour protection armor may act as suitable habitat for certain species, potentially increasing settlement in wind farm areas. Next slide. Next one. So we would like to thank, and acknowledge the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, United States Department of Interior, for funding this work. And at BOEM, our supervisors were Brian Hooker, who is here at the meeting, but also Jennifer Drar, Tom Kilpatrick, Ursula Housen, and Travis Washington, who all provided a lot of valuable suggestions for this study, and we thank them. And this presentation is based on this, and our co-authors are listed here at the bottom. Ellie Simpson, who was going to present this, Michael Bell, who's actually here in the group as well to help answer questions, and Ola Peterson also on the hydrodynamics. But then we also had Josh Van Berkel, Fleming Hansen, and a number of others helping us with this project to completion. And next slide. And next slide. That's it. I think next slide is Q&A.
Thank you, Tom, for that presentation and the study that you shared. Any quick questions for Tom before we just open it up for general discussion and Q&A? Ron, go ahead, please.
Just a quick question. In the modeling exercises, yours and the others, do you use a what temperature do you use as a lethal temperature for scallop larval mortality?
I'm going to let Michael answer that. I think I know the answer, but I think I'll let, for our study, I'll let Michael answer. You have to unmute Michael.
There's a button. Yeah, I think it was it was maybe like 20, 21 or something like that.
I think it was 20 degrees Celsius. Yeah.
So the surface water in the mid-Atlantic at many times is like 27 degrees.
Yes. So the ABM template allows for the larva to sense temperature and then swim down away from these temperatures. So it basically it moves it into a different elevation in the water column.
Right, but during most of the year there isn't a lot of mixing until, you know, after October sometime. So the question is where the thermocline is located and what's the temperature between the surface and the thermocline.
Right. So we used as the initial conditions, we used HICOM to set up the thermal stratification, and then the model then would run, and we calibrated against the Pioneer array, the thermal distribution through the water column. It's all covered in the report too, Ron. It's
Okay.
a hard thing to explain in a short period of time, but I guess what I would say is the model that we used was we looked at it very carefully, and one of the reasons why we did not use 2019, if you notice, we dropped that up that year, was we couldn't calibrate on temperature.
Yeah, well, when we have a discussion, we could talk more about that. The other thing is in one of the presentations, you indicated what percentage of the larvae in the water column actually settle. It was under 1%.
That would have been Liesl.
Right, yeah. So it was with the passive, yeah, it was under 1%. There are a lot of loss, a lot of mortality with passive behavior.
Well, I mean, 99% don't
which
settle is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, 99%, which is, yeah, realistic. We kind of know that 99%.
Okay, I'll hold off until discussion.
Okay.
All right, I think Sarah had her hand next, and then Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Both sets of presentations, that was really interesting. It was a lot to take in. I guess the question that I had was, you made mention about, you know, validating some of these models and the challenges associated with that. So I was just curious. I was curious if there's been, you know, in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, if there are areas where there is, whether or not they've seen impacts, similar impacts to what you have suggested in your models. So in other words, have there been, for example, you know, either a decline or no changes in shellfish or, you know, different fisheries, particularly if those changes have been coupled at all with any kind of modeling that they've done in other parts of the world. And I'm not sure who would be best to answer that. I would love to hear answers from all of you, actually, or each group.
Yeah, I can definitely. Yeah. No, sorry. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, it's very species dependent. And in Europe, there are a few models also. I would say that usually there is like an increase in habitat. So it just increases the larval connectivity. And they use, the larvae can use the offshore wind farm as like stepping stone. So it's getting more positive overall in this model. Regarding validation, this is very hard to validate because it's very hard to find a larvae in the water. But there are a few techniques like genetic, and I've done, I've compared previous model before with some genetic studies or some otolith, microchemistry, etc. But yes, overall, we really like data in validating the outputs.
Any other of our presenters want to jump in on that question?
So Michael and I have not actually been involved with the European studies. DHI has done those kind of studies, but we can't comment because we weren't the PIs.
All right, thank you. Daniel.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to all the presenters. The larval sediment and distribution topics near and dear to my heart. One thing that there are just a couple of observations that I'd be curious if they were considered or if they're not considered as being relevant in a modeling, an ABM type approach. But one of them is for Liesl and Nikitas, when you had the spawning areas modeled, they seem to be uniformly populated. Is that fair? Or I was looking for some of the fecundity hotspots that are known to exist in the scallop populations, like those off of George's Bank, and those didn't seem to be captured in the model. So that was just one point, or one curiosity.
Very quickly, they were not, and also because yes, we had a very long domain, so we were trying to find fecundity data everywhere, and we did. But the model is the release is stochastic, so it really depends on the size of the area. And what I mentioned, I showed like the spawning area with coordinates, but we also have depth. So we had we had data on the bathymetry for the spawning areas and settlement areas, and they differ depending on the species, etc. So, but yes, you're right, we didn't incorporate fecundity.
One thing I want to add here, Daniel, is that the George's Bank area was not in the model to begin with anyway. We stopped in Montauk.
Okay. I didn't catch that. So thank you for that. The other question is like, what about how powerful, and Ron, I think you've done some research on this too. How powerful would some of the localized oceanographic features be in a model like this, in an ABM based model? And I'm thinking particularly about some of the rotary currents that are seen off of George's. And again, Nikitas, if that wasn't in the original model, understood. But also the solitons that come across and do a lot of vertical stratification, or destratification, I should say, potentially kind of throughout the year. Is there a way to incorporate those extremely stochastic events, or are those just not? Would those just get averaged out in a typical modeling exercise like this?
So I can address two of the two things I think I heard you say, Daniel. The rotary currents around George's Banks is included in our model. So we did look at the overall oceanography of the area and tried to make sure that we were matching that. Solitons, sadly, no. We are not. That's way too detailed for this size of a model, regional scale model. So no, that's not in there.
And then I think, Liesl, just another technology that I've been aware of that may be useful for some of this validation work is, the video plankton recorders or the holographic camera systems that can sometimes get at the veliger stages of the sea scallop. That could be a fun area of.
Yes, I use one for some other study for Atlantic sturgeon. yes, I'm hoping one day I can fund it for that for offshore wind studies. But yes, there is also a GNA, by the way, and we are working on invasive species here in Washington State in the Salish Sea for green crab, and we are using larval dispersal model and DNA and eGNA, sorry, to compare. So.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, we can Jim, turn to you.
Sure. Maybe you guys can help us out here on the West Coast and speculate what the differences would be. Like, what are the driving forces in your model of the piles themselves versus the wind? For those of us who are going to be more in the floating.
That's a really good question, Jim. And it's addressed in our report. You'll see different researchers come up with different answers, but in our estimates, and I'll let, if Ola Peterson is still here, maybe I should let him speak. But if I recall right, the monopiles were representing about 10% of the impact on the current speed. So 90% of it is the wind reduction. But also remember, on the West Coast, you've got a very deep water, so you're going to have a different. It's going to affect your area less, in my opinion, because of the depth of the water. Ola, do you want to add to that?
Oh, I think that's pretty complete. So as Tom said, it is the wind footprint. It's really the biggest impact on the mixing because of the massive extraction of wind. That's the main purpose, and I think that would be the same also on the West Coast. You will have risers, but they are very small, and even if they are long, I can't see they would be very important. But of course, the wind mixing is near the surface. That's where it has the biggest impact, and how in deeper waters that may be a little bit different.
And from RPS and Tetra Tech side, I totally agree that as I said in the presentation, that the wind was the driver, not the monopile drag, at least on the scale of the model. But upwelling obviously is extremely important to the Pacific, and we definitely want to look more into what's happening with the bipole, the bipoles that are created by those wind farms. We want to look a little bit more on our results to make sense of what happens with convergence zones and things of that nature that are very important, coherent structures and things like that. That could be very important in the Pacific as well. So I can't give an answer without really studying it, but I do know that upwelling is extremely important in the Pacific.
But the upwelling will also be due to the wind.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yes, agree 100%.
Can I add something to Daniel?
Yes,
talk
please.
About solitons, which is a very, very complicated and very, you say, stochastic phenomenon. So all hydrodynamic modelers, they want to avoid it by all means. but still, the idea of the modeling here is basically that we keep track of the energy, also on the internal energy, you can say. So somehow solitons, they are included. They are kind of more smeared out. We kept the energy right. The mixing may come in a different place because of that, but still it is there. So the stratified stratification dynamics will still have an effect also on the mixing.
Thank you for that. No, that's well put.
Jim or Caroline, I don't want to jump in front of Ron, but I have a quick follow-up to Jim's question that Tom answered. Is that
Sure,
okay?
go ahead, Steve.
Yeah,
Yes.
so Tom, obviously we have deeper water here, but the turbines that we're aware of that are being proposed are much larger, and I've seen them with a blade diameter of 230 some meters. So, that's the equivalent of a 10-acre field. in the swept area of those blades. So would the size of the turbines, the size of the swept area of the blades affect this in any way?
So we actually did study the 15 megawatt wind turbines, and their swept area is 240 meters, just like Nikita showed in his presentation. So when you look at our report, you'll see something very similar. So I don't know if they're going to be going even bigger on the West Coast, if the wind turbine generator manufacturers are actually going to be able to produce something even bigger than the 15 megawatt. But if they do, then yeah, that will have an effect, of course. It will extract more energy from the wind. The bigger you get, the more energy is extracted.
Right.
And if I may follow up on that, there's definitely, it circles back to the question about the international scene and what they find there. Like I said before, 15 megawatt wind farms don't exist, as far as I know. And, even SAR data from the ones that we have in Rhode Island, we're talking about 6 megawatt turbines, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe resolution would be a little bigger. But what we found, and it's in the report, there's a huge difference between the wind wake that's created from 5 to 10 to 15 megawatts in terms of both length and extraction, as Tom says. So if wind is 90% of the game, the more you extract, the more you'll see.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go to Ron and then Brian and then Sarah.
So I think these two modeling exercises are very interesting. I have a lot of experience out there with scallops, probably close to 50 years now. And I think what the modeling is saying is that larval settlement is probably not going to be impacted by the presence of the wind farms to any great extent. The real question, though, isn't larval settlement. It's survival of the newly settled larvae. And that potentially could be impacted significantly by the presence of wind farms and the changes in ecology brought about by the wind farms. Now, a couple of observations, and be curious of your response. First of all, we're seeing major oceanographic shifts in water movement in these areas. They're being monitored. We have a lot of sampling tools on fishing vessels right now. There's a lot of work being done by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and what have you. We had a period of time around the year 2000 where there's very few scallops in the mid-Atlantic, but we had a great population of scallops up in the lightship area, and that had apparently repopulated the area in the New York Bight. So a tremendous amount in that particular case of the recruitment came from George's Bank that settled in the Hudson Canyon area. We've also had experiences where we've seen scallops spat on top of instrumentation moored off the bottom in areas that we never see scallops on the bottom. And so I'm just curious, the issue of, I personally think we have a predation issue on the newly settled scallops between when they're 250 microns and when we first start seeing them in our optical surveys, 6 to 12 months later. And you could have an area where your models show large amount of settlement of larvae, but in fact, only a very small portion of the area, the scallops survive. And I'm just thinking that that's a predation issue, which may be the more important thing to study. Anyway, thank you for your presentations.
Any comments from our two presenters?
Well, that wasn't our study. What we were asked to do was look at settlement, and we recognize that settlement does not equal recruitment. So we're in 100% agreement with you, Ron, that it may be that while we see a bunch of stuff or a bunch of settlement in an area, it may not mean that they survive to commercial size. But could we look at predation, and could we look at other ways of trying to understand, recruitment through to juvenile and above? The answer is probably yes, but the data is probably going to be pretty sparse. So whether what we do is defensible scientifically, you can model almost anything, but you can't necessarily prove that what you're modeling is actually what happens down the line. I think we're very confident in the fact that we match certain biomass in our baseline calibration efforts and validation efforts. So we show the different species landing in areas where there is biomass available, or from looking at surveys. And we also have stuff show up. When we talked to Daphne Monroe, we had settlement off of Virginia that doesn't show in the surveys. But when we talked to Daphne, she said, no, we've been doing surveys there recently for Dominion, and we're finding pre-commercial size surf clams there, but nobody has actually reported that yet. And so she was saying, your model is right. We were thinking it was wrong. That's why we went to her. And she said, no, your model's right, but you're right. There is no data yet to prove that you're right, except for my little study that I did for Dominion.
I would not have more to say. I mean, that's, yeah, we don't include survival, and I've done some model that Tom mentioned, like dynamic population model. They need a lot of data, yes. So, but they are pretty interesting, but they do need a lot of data.
Oh, we'd love to do it.
Yeah, same.
Interaction modeling is interesting. Daniel, the equivalent of what George's Bank, that recirculation and rotary currents that you're talking about, is also existing on the Hudson River Canyon area, and this is something that, as Ron was talking about, that's something that we find as part of the settlement, at least zone, starting from there to New Jersey for the most part in our model. So, which sounds like it's also what Tom's group showed, with a little bit more expansion on the Virginia side.
Ole, did you have a comment on this discussion? I'm sorry, I saw your hand pop up earlier and meant to.
It was just to Nikita. The 15 megawatt turbine has just parked out here and been installed now, so it's coming.
Yes, there is one. You're absolutely right.
Yes, and it's big.
And it's huge.
Yeah, so they had to block all roads and.
So was that 50?
15
what was
megawatt.
15 or
15.
Okay.
So I said before that it doesn't exist, but there is one just outside. Yes.
And where is that?
Just north here of Copenhagen, out in Denmark, in the test center.
Can you send me to look at that, Caroline?
Yeah,
I can send you a video of the transport, and that's
Please do that. Yes.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. All right, we'll go to Sarah next question.
Hi, I was just curious, this might actually be a question for Ron. I'm thinking about this from the economic perspective for the fishery. When you're talking about, relatively small, order, what was it? 4 orders of magnitude less recruitment or settlement. As I understand it, the scallop industry is a pretty lucrative fishery. And particularly when you talk about the changes in where scallops might end up, I was curious, first of all, whether or not, you know, how much of a line there is, like how much, I can't think of the economic term at the moment. It's very common, but I'm just blanking. But how much of a, you know, could a small difference make to this fishery? And then second, how it's managed in terms of area. So I know, like from the little I know of the fishery from another project, there are like different blocks that can be fished in. And if you're talking about a shift from, you know, somewhere in the north, and there's going to be an increase, you know, further south in Virginia, you know, does that make a difference in terms of who has access to the scallops there?
Can I answer something on the modeling side of thing before you answer, Ron? Just to make sure you understood what we were saying. What we were saying
please.
was that the settlement change compared to overall settlement, right, is 4 orders of magnitude. So it's a very small change compared to the overall settlement in a wind energy. I'm sorry, in a destination area. The problem with the model, perhaps, and something that we have suggested in another proposal, is that maybe what we're looking at with these destination areas where we're using, you know, the designations from nymphs are too large, right? So you have a destination area of, you know, that's the size of Rhode Island or you know, half of New Jersey out into the ocean. That's probably too big. And what we said in our conclusions, localized patches probably will change. And those localized patches are maybe what you're talking about, Sarah, but that's what, there may be more study needed to break it down, to look at, you know, the different connectivity between different areas, but then also looking at, if you get too small, if you get to a 1 meter size, let's say, to be ridiculous, and nothing settles there, you know, during when there's a wind farm, and one thing settled there when there wasn't a wind farm, well, you have 100% change. Well, that's ridiculous. So there is a proper size to really get at an understanding of what we're calling localized changes. That may be important to different, you know, fishermen, because that's their patch. So that wasn't part of our study. We used very large areas, and when you look at the DB scan clustering that we did, it's obvious that was our attempt, actually, to look at smaller areas within these destination areas that we had defined. That's where you see the differences. So when you have a chance to look at the report when it comes out, that's where we give an indication of what these localized changes may look like. So sorry to
no, that's great. Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful, especially about, you know, how you were quantifying that. That's really useful. But yeah, I'd be curious, Ron. I mean, I know it's not managed it's not within state waters, but I don't know what.
Rotational area management. We manage the scallop fleet, the limited access fleet, which is around 340 larger vessels, as a single entity, because they're capable of going anywhere within the range of the scallop resource. And we look at we find now with our survey methods, we could find beds of scallops when they're 2 years old. You know, we actually could see them at 1 year old, but at 2 years old, if we see a bed of scallops, then we know it has a high chance of survival. So that we design an area around it, we close it for 2 or 3 years. We figure out when the optimum time is to open it, and then we allocate trips to the fleet. Now, I think this modeling exercise supports what I believe all the time, is that we have larval settlement over vast areas. Some areas are higher density than other areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll survive there. While other areas might have a lower settlement, but have a higher level of survival. And the patchiness is we have an area to the east of these wind farms that are south of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket that we call the Nantucket Lightship area. And it's always has scallops. And sometimes in great abundance, sometimes in very limited abundance. We're dependent on incoming recruitment. But our knowledge of the incoming recruitment is when we could first see them, which is a year after they settle at the earliest. And we had a patch of scallops. We had a 2012 settlement that had led to a patch of scallops that might have been 10 miles by 20 miles in area, very dense. And I know scallops settled everywhere there, but that's the area that they grew up in. And we were able to allocate over a course of 3 years, 6 trips, landed $500 million of scallops from that one area. Now, I'm concerned that maybe the wind farms might impact larval settlement, but I'm more concerned that somehow they might impact scallop survival during that first year because of impacts they have on other species, the predator species. And the biggest problem we have now is we don't know what the predators are on a scallop from 250 microns to 25 millimeters. But personally, I think sea urchins eat the darn things when they newly settle. Literature shows sea urchins eating 250 micron crab larvae. And then these little shrimps that are down there, the copepods, they're all capable of eating these newly settled scallops. And the impact of the riprap fields around the turbines may be more significant than the impact, the wake effects that occur. The other impact that the wind farms might have is turbidity. And the turbidity might have more impact on larval recruitment than in fact the settlement issue. So while this is good work, I think it supports my belief. I don't think we have to get more precise than what these two studies have shown. I think we now need to question what the next set of projects should be. Thanks.
Can I jump in here, at least for the turbidity part, Ron? I think what you're saying makes sense a little. We did look at sediment mobility in our studies. I think Tom's study from 2021 had it as well. I'm not sure about this new study. And we didn't see much difference in, sediment mobility, at least, on the scale of these models, at least.
Yeah, but there's
Just something
different
to look
phases
at.
of construction that weren't included in our study. The installation of the monopiles and the pile driving may increase turbidity that is nothing to do with the in-place systems and the placement of the armor stone around the wind turbines. That may also increase locally and for a very short time turbidity. But that's all about construction, and that was not the subject of our study.
For sure. If you're talking about construction, that's totally
Yeah.
different game. Yeah.
We'll go to Stephen Joner next, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I just want to thank Sarah for asking that question, Ron, because I was going to ask a similar one. And I thought that was very helpful, Ron. I know quite a bit about sablefish larvae, but all I know about sea scallop larvae is when they grow up, they're really tasty. So I think we could benefit as a committee to have a little more discussion on this, maybe at our next monthly meeting, because throughout the presentation, which I found very interesting, I don't have any context for it because I don't know really anything about the scallops. And you know, obviously you can, as Tom said, model anything, but you know, you need to do some ground truthing. So my experience as a fishery manager for species like sablefish and halibut and so forth is, you know, the modeling gives you a good start, but really you need to test it by seeing what's on the water. So I think a lot of the questions or a lot of what you've looked at on the East Coast could apply out here. You know, we have concerns about what will settle on these massive structures that are supporting anchoring the 15 megawatt turbines, and how will that affect predation on some of these groundfish larvae that are very susceptible to that. So anyway, Caroline and Jim, I hope we can have a follow-up on this as a committee.
Absolutely. Thank you for that comment, Steve. This is, I mean, we'll definitely plan to talk more about kind of related topics at our next meeting, but can dive in deeper in our committee meetings as well. Sarah, I think I saw your hand, but I'm not sure if it was residual.
No, I guess
Okay.
I put it down on accident, but I was going to ask a question from the chat from Tim Sipple. Is it possible to compare what the impacts of climate change are expected to be on larval transport and settlement in the absence of offshore wind with numerical model results like this? Can the effects be disentangled? I imagine the answer is no, but worth getting a perspective on.
You want me to go first, Nikitas? I think there's been a lot of really good work by Glenn Gavarkovitz at Woods Hole Group to look at, you know, the changes in the marine climatology over the last 20 years that kind of indicate what may happen going forward. I think if you use some of that change that has been measured recently and try to extrapolate that in some way in a model is possible. But can we predict the future? No, not hand over my heart. Yes, I'm going to be able to predict what climate change is going to do. But I think we have some ability to look at marine heat waves that have already occurred, maybe get those into a model, and then in some way, Ola Peterson's probably going to yell at me after this meeting, but we could enhance those kind of changes to give a simulation of what would happen with climate change. Then all of the things that Ron was asking about temperature becomes really relevant with regards to different species where their survivability is based on their ability to get away from a certain temperature, and you may have more mortality. And so, yeah, I think there's a real possibility to do something, but it will be incremental. It won't be a forecast. It'll be more of a hindcast that we then perturbate to try to get an idea of what we think might happen, as opposed to taking the climate change information from the UN and then saying, okay, now we're going to run this, and then our model will definitely capture all of this. I'm not sure I would agree with that. There are other climatology experts out there that are looking at basin-wide stuff, and even those models, I think, have a lot of margin of error in them. This is so specific. If you want to know what happens to larvae on the shelf due to climate change, I think we would struggle to be able to say we absolutely know the answer, but I think we can simulate, different scenarios.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the variables that you're putting into the models just don't exist for climate models, and probably also at the proper scale. Okay, thank you.
About 10 years ago, Sarah, I had a model for EPA, a project for EPA to actually project an and manage the future for Long Island Sound. And we did exactly what Tom was talking about, downscale global climate models. We did a 30-year hindcast of, we looked at with Connecticut Deep. We worked on the whole thing about the gilts moving up, the warm gilts moving up and the cold gilts moving up, Gulf of Maine. And we ran the models all the way to 2100 based on data from GCMs from GFDL. So temperature, specific things like lethality of temperature we're talking about, assuming either adaptation or no adaptation of the species, and those kind of uncertainties, within those bounds, it can be done, but there's so many uncertainties, like Tom says as well, that, you have to take it with a grain of salt. At least we can see a couple of things, though, with that approach.
Okay, thank you both. I appreciate it.
And when we were at the National Academy talking about copepods and North Atlantic right whales, and Glenn gave a very great presentation that I think Brian Hooker was there as well. I think some of the changes due to climate change, or at least climatology change that he is seeing occurring off of Cape Cod, those effects are bigger, way bigger than what you see due to wind farms. So from a fisheries point of view, I'm not sure looking at offshore wind farms as the major threat that's not it.
To put that a little bit into perspective, it was about 1.5 degrees Celsius over the last 30 years on Long Island Sound warming. And, you're thinking about Paris, and 1.5 degree was the original target. We're looking to about 0.25 degrees. So it's, at least with our modeling, we're looking at about 0.25 degrees. The question, though, is that going to be like in 3 years, and then over the creation of those farms, and it's going to be there? But those are is it going to somehow affect or stress the species because it's so quick? I'm not sure about, I definitely don't, it's beyond my knowledge to talk about adaptation of species and things.
Well, with that final comment, thank you. We are kind of at the time of our meeting. I wanted to thank our panelists, our presentations from Nikitas and Liesel and Tom, this second part of our meeting, and earlier today from Coonamessett Farm. I'm blanking, sorry, on
Foundation.
Thank you. And all of the great discussion and Q&A. I feel like this has been a very productive meeting just from the committee perspective. And I will, Jim, give you a few words and then turn it over to Brian Hooker if you have any closing comments from BOEM.
Thank you. I just want to echo the thanks. This was a great, robust conversation. I really appreciated the discussion. I also want to remind committee members that we have our next meeting is in early January. We have a call scheduled where we'll come back to some of the topics and discussion and think about how this will inform our spring meeting. Brian, do you want to sort of close this out?
Yeah, I think I was just gonna to tack on I think what you just said and what Stephen Joner said about this type of discussion that we just had right now on all on these hydrodynamic effects and larval transport. I think was just to get kind of the juices going a little bit about maybe some topics you might want to consider for that spring meeting. And we do have some studies, or at least one study going on the Pacific right now. I don't know if there'll be any results that we can really share them, but there have been some other published stuff in the Pacific that we can perhaps bring into the conversation. But I think after hearing what you heard today, I think it might help formulate like some more specific areas of interest and investigation. So again, you know, I really appreciate the discussion over the past 2 afternoons. And I think I know I find it helpful to be able to have this dialogue, not only from, you know, from what we discussed yesterday, but some of the dialogue today as well. And then be able to provide this to folks who, you know, through that meeting recording that will be available for everyone after the meeting. So again, thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you again in the spring.
Great, thanks, Brian. And just a final logistics from the National Academies. Look for event recording on the event webpage, as well as we will post the presentations that we can share, and follow the website as well for updates on when we select dates for the spring meeting. So we'll share everything through our website. And thank you all for the great questions and participation during the last 2 afternoons. Have a great holidays and Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everyone.